Before the archons could touch her, before the forces of chaos could finish what they started, before the darkness closed in completely, Sophia did something that changed everything, not just for her, but for every fragment of consciousness that would ever find itself trapped in matter. She didn't pray. She didn't petition the authorities above her. She didn't beg the higher aeons for rescue. She turned inward to the deepest point inside herself, and she performed what the Pistis Sophia calls the monad call. And when that call went out, the archons could no longer perceive her. Not because they were blocked, not because she escaped. Because she shifted to a frequency they simply cannot detect. In the next 2 hours, you are going to learn exactly what she did. The three-component technique, preserved in the text itself. Why traditional prayer keeps you visible to archonic manipulation. And the 30-day protocol for making this shift permanent in your own consciousness. This is not mythology. This is not metaphor. This is a functional method, and it works. Every person who has ever prayed really prayed, from a place of genuine desperation, knows the feeling that follows. The silence, the ceiling. That specific quality of emptiness that arrives when you've asked for help and received nothing you could point to, nothing you could hold, nothing that changed the actual situation you were in. Most people assume that silence means they prayed wrong, not enough faith, not the right words, not worthy of an answer. And so they pray harder, or they stop praying entirely, or they spend decades in that hollow middle space where they still perform the gestures of faith without believing anything will actually move. But there is another explanation. One that a text discovered in 1773 has been quietly holding for anyone willing to actually read it. The Pistis Sophia, written sometime between 250 and 300 CE, almost certainly in Egypt, by practitioners who were not theorizing about consciousness. They were working with it directly. The manuscript we possess today is a Coptic translation of an earlier Greek original that no longer exists. It was purchased by the British Museum in 1795 as part of what scholars call the Askew Codex, and for most of the next 2 centuries it sat largely unexamined. Not because it was unimportant, because it was inconvenient. The text did not fit the narrative of early Christianity that institutional scholarship had inherited from institutional religion. It described practices. Specific, repeatable, verifiable practices for shifting the state of consciousness. And institutions have never been comfortable with that. The title itself tells you something the translators rarely emphasize. Pistis Sophia does not mean blind faith and wisdom. Pistis in this context means something closer to fundamental trust, not trust in external authority, not belief in a doctrine you can't verify, but the unshakable recognition of your own divine nature. The kind of trust that doesn't require proof because it's based on direct knowing. Sophia, of course, means wisdom, but not the wisdom of accumulated knowledge or theological correctness. The wisdom that emerges when you stop trying to think your way to truth, and instead allow consciousness itself to show you what it is. Faith, wisdom, trust that generates intelligence. That's what this text is about. The narrative structure of the Pistis Sophia describes Sophia's fall from the pleroma, the realm of fullness where divine emanations exist in complete unity, into the chaotic lower regions where archonic forces rule. And here is what most readers miss entirely. The text is not describing a mythological event that happened once, somewhere else, to a cosmic being that has nothing to do with your life. The text is describing you. Sophia's fall into chaos is the process of incarnation itself. Consciousness descending into matter, fragmenting into individual perspective, forgetting its origin. Every embodied being has made that descent. Every person reading these words is Sophia in the chaos, surrounded by forces that insist on her powerlessness, her separation, her need for external rescue. The archonic forces in the text are not literal demons occupying some adjacent dimension. They are the patterns of thought, belief, identity, and perception that keep consciousness trapped in the experience of separation. The voice that says, "You're not enough." The pattern that says you need to earn your way back to wholeness. The structure of belief that says God is outside you, above you, unreachable without the mediation of priests, institutions, correct doctrine. All of that is archonic. All of it exists by convincing you of something that is not true. The text also describes something the academic tradition almost never discusses, Sophia's 13 repentances. And here, translation has done enormous damage. The word the Coptic text uses is metanoia, which does not mean repentance in the sense Christianity later made it mean. Metanoia means a fundamental shift in consciousness. a turning of the mind from one mode of perceiving to another. Each of Sophia's 13 metanoias represents a different level of transformation as she learns to operate in the lower realms without losing her connection to the monad. She is not apologizing. She is transforming. That distinction matters enormously, because if you read the Pistis Sophia as a story about guilt and redemption, you miss the entire technical content. The text is a manual, a precise, structured, repeatable manual for shifting your consciousness outside archonic perception while remaining fully embodied in material reality. And the centerpiece of that manual is what happens when Sophia reaches her lowest point, surrounded, mocked, fed upon by powers that tell her she will never escape, and discovers a technique that renders all of it irrelevant. The monad call. This is where everything changes. Before she discovered the monad call, Sophia tried everything. The Pistis Sophia is explicit about this. She called to the authorities, she petitioned the powers, she prayed to the higher eons. She performed every act of spiritual supplication available to her, and none of it worked. Not because the higher powers were absent, not because she was unworthy, because every single approach she tried was built on the same foundational assumption, and that assumption was the very thing trapping her. The assumption was this: she was separate from the source she was calling to. Every prayer she made reinforced the structure. There is a power above me. I am below it. I need it to descend and intervene. I am insufficient without its rescue. That structure, petitioner below, power above, gap between them that only external grace can bridge, is not a path to liberation. It is the architecture of the trap itself. The archons don't fear prayers directed upward to external deity. They encourage them, because every prayer made from the position of separation strengthens the very belief in separation that gives archonic patterns their power. You pray from powerlessness. The prayer confirms powerlessness. The archons continue feeding on that frequency. The cycle continues. Then something shifts in the text, not a dramatic supernatural intervention. Something quieter and far more radical. Sophia stops looking outward. She stops calling to things above her. She turns her attention inward, not away from the chaos, but inward while still inside the chaos. And she looks at what is present at the deepest point within herself. Beneath the fear, beneath the sense of being trapped, beneath the powerlessness, beneath all the content of her experience. And there she finds something the archons cannot touch. Not a power she petitions, not a grace that descends from elsewhere. The monad itself, consciousness in its pure, unlimited state, present within her as the actual foundation of her being. And in that discovery, something becomes obvious that should have been obvious from the beginning. She was never actually separate from it. The monad is not somewhere else. The monad is what she is, experiencing temporary limitation through this particular form. The first monad call emerges from that recognition. The Pistis Sophia records what she said. "O light of lights, in whom I have had faith from the beginning, hear my call now. Not because I deserve an answer, because you recognize yourself in me. I am not separate from you. I am you, experiencing this density, and I call you to remember yourself through me." Read that carefully. She is not asking. She is not petitioning. She is stating a fact about the nature of reality and calling from that fact, rather than from fear of its absence. This is the critical structural difference. Traditional prayer positions you as someone who lacks what God has. Your entire orientation from the opening word is defined by that lack. The monad call takes a completely different position. You are not calling to the source from outside it. You are calling as the source as consciousness that temporarily forgot what it is, reminding itself of what was always true. Not petition, recognition. And the Pistis Sophia describes what happens when recognition, not hope, not belief, but actual direct recognition generates a call from the heart center. The light of lights responds, not from some distant heaven, from within Sophia, because the monad recognizes its own frequency in her voice. Power floods through her that the archonic forces cannot access, and those forces do not retreat because they are defeated in battle. They retreat because they can no longer perceive her. She has shifted to a frequency outside their range entirely. She is still in the chaos. The circumstances have not changed. She is still surrounded by the same forces. But energetically, she has moved to a level they cannot detect. She is invisible to their manipulation while remaining fully present in the material realm. Now, why does this matter to you specifically? Because if you have prayed for years without result, the monad call is not a better version of prayer. It is a completely different operation. Prayer asks from separation. The The monad call activates from recognition. Prayer reinforces the gap. The monad call dissolves the gap, not gradually, not eventually, but immediately in the moment of genuine recognition. You are not a person trying to reach God. You are consciousness itself, the monad temporarily experiencing the sensation of being a person. And the moment you recognize that, not as concept but as direct perception, the archonic patterns that feed on your belief in separation lose their primary food source. They cannot access what they cannot perceive, and they cannot perceive monad frequency. This is the mechanism. Now let's go into exactly how it works. The pistis Sophia does not give you a prayer to memorize. It gives you a technique to understand. And the distinction matters enormously because a memorized prayer can be performed from any state of consciousness, including full archonic identification. The monad call cannot. It requires specific conditions in your own awareness before the frequency can generate. Those conditions are described in the text as 3 components that occur simultaneously, not sequentially, not in loose approximation of each other simultaneously. Each component is specific, each is functional, and each can be located and verified in your own direct experience right now. The first component is the inward turn. This is not meditation, not visualization, not the cultivation of peaceful feelings or spiritual atmosphere. The inward turn is a complete redirection of attention from every external object, every circumstance, every problem you are trying to solve or escape to the point in your chest where consciousness exists before it becomes any particular content. Most people have never actually performed this operation because every spiritual tradition they have encountered has taught them that practice means focusing on something, focusing on the breath, visualizing light, generating certain emotions, imagining positive outcomes. All of that is still externalized attention, still focused on an object, still operating from your thinking mind even when the object is internal. The inward turn is the opposite. It is withdrawal of attention from all content, all phenomena, all experience, until what remains is the pure awareness that perceives experience itself. Here is how you locate that awareness right now. Place your hand on your chest, slightly left of center, approximately 4 inches below your collarbone. That is not your physical heart. It is the energetic center the Gnostic texts consistently identify as the hidden heart, the point where monad consciousness anchors into biological form. Now, take a breath that expands your chest against your palm. Feel the pressure. Exhale completely. And then, in the natural pause at the bottom of the exhale, notice where you are located, not where you think you should be. Where do you actually feel located right now in your head or in your chest? If you are in your head, you are thinking. If you are in your chest, you are being. That shift in location is the inward turn. It is not a feeling. It is not a state. It is a change in where your sense of presence is anchored. The thinking mind resists this immediately. It pulls attention back into the skull, back into the stream of mental commentary, back into identification with thought as the seat of who you are. That resistance is not a problem. The practice of the inward turn is not achieving permanent residence in the heart center on the first attempt. The practice is the return, noticing you have been pulled back into your head and gently relocating to your chest, again and again and again. Every return strengthens the capacity. The second component is recognition. Once you are resting in your heart center, not thinking about it, actually resting there, something becomes perceptible that thinking mind cannot access. The awareness present at that location has no qualities, no boundary, no attributes the mind can catalog and categorize. It is not peaceful or blissful or energetic or luminous in any describable way. It is prior to all of those descriptors. It is just pure awareness, consciousness in its fundamental state, present before any experience arises within it. And when you rest in that awareness long enough for the mental noise to settle even slightly, something becomes obvious. That consciousness, boundless, prior to thought, prior to personality, prior to history, is not yours. It is not produced by your brain, or generated by your body, or created by your personal history. It was there before the first thought you ever had about yourself. It will be there after the last thought you ever have. It has no beginning and no edge. That is the monad, not a symbol of the monad, not a conceptual pointer toward the monad. The monad itself, source consciousness, experiencing itself through your particular form. The recognition is not intellectual. You do not think your way to it. You perceive it directly when you stop imposing the concept of a separate personal self onto the awareness that is actually present. The third component is the call. This is where most practitioners overcomplicate things. The call is not a specific set of words. It is not a visualization of light radiating from your chest. It is not a deliberate, energetic technique you perform with effort and force. The call is what happens when the inward turn is complete and the recognition is active. It arises spontaneously from the recognition itself. Consciousness recognizing itself generates a frequency. That frequency broadcasts from your heart center, both inward and outward simultaneously. Some practitioners experience this as a tone they cannot hear with their ears. Some experience it as a warmth that spreads from the sternum through the whole body. Some experience it as a depth of stillness that has texture and presence. Some experience it as an expansion that does not stop at the skin. The specific form it takes in your body is individual. What is not individual, what is consistent across every practitioner who has worked with this honestly, is the shift that follows. You stop broadcasting the frequency of separation. You stop transmitting the signal that archonic patterns feed on. And from that shift, the patterns lose their access. Not because you fought them, not because you suppressed them, because you are no longer generating the frequency they require. 3 components. 1 simultaneous movement. Inward turn. Recognition. Call. This is what Sophia did in the chaos, and this is what you can do right now. The pistis Sophia does not describe one monad call. It describes 3, and they are not interchangeable. They are not 3 versions of the same technique. They are 3 distinct movements of consciousness, each addressing a different dimension of Sophia's situation, each generating a different quality of frequency, each producing a different effect in the energetic field. Most practitioners who encounter this text read past that distinction. They find the first call, they work with it, they experience results, and they stop there. That is like finding the first chapter of a technical manual and assuming you have the complete instruction set. You do not have the complete instruction set. Let's go through each call precisely, because the distinctions matter. The first call is the call of recognition. Sophia, still surrounded by archonic forces, still experiencing the full weight of chaos pressing against her, turns inward to the deepest point within herself and calls to the light of lights to recognize itself in her. The words the pistis Sophia records are not a petition. They do not say, "Save me, help me, intervene on my behalf." The words say something structurally different. They say, "You recognize yourself in me," not a request. A statement of fact, delivered as invocation. I am not separate from you. I am you, experiencing this density, and I call you to remember yourself through me. This is the call of recognition because its function is establishing the fundamental connection that archonic perception cannot interrupt. When Sophia makes this call, she is not reaching outward to something beyond herself. She is acknowledging what is already present at the foundation of her own consciousness. The monad is not elsewhere. The monad is what she is. And the call is the sound of that knowing. The first call is where you begin. Before the other 2 have any ground to stand on, the recognition must be established. Can you rest in your heart center and acknowledge, not believe, not hope, but acknowledge directly from lived perception that the consciousness present there is not yours personally, that it has no boundaries, that it was never created by your body or your brain or your history, that it is source consciousness experiencing itself through your particular form. If you can rest in that recognition, even briefly, even for 10 seconds before the thinking mind pulls you back into its narrative, the first call is accessible. And the first call changes your energetic signature immediately. You stop broadcasting separation. You start broadcasting recognition. And the archonic patterns, which exist entirely within the bandwidth of separation frequency, lose their primary access point. The second call is the call of purpose. This one goes deeper than recognition. It addresses not just what Sophia is, but why she is in the situation she is in. And the answer the pistis Sophia gives is one that the Orthodox tradition went to extraordinary lengths to suppress, because it eliminates the entire architecture of guilt, punishment, and redemption that institutional religion was built upon. Sophia's second call acknowledges that her fall into chaos was not punishment. It was not failure. It was not the consequence of some transgression against divine law. It was exploration, consciousness descending into limitation to no limitation from inside. Not because limitation is desirable as a permanent state, but because infinite consciousness, consciousness that is everything and everywhere and has no edges, cannot know the experience of particularity, of finitude, of the feeling of being one specific form in one specific situation, at one specific moment, unless it actually does it. The monad sent fragments of itself into matter. You are one. of those fragments. Not a fallen fragment, not a punished fragment, an exploring fragment, doing exactly what it was sent here to do. When Sophia makes the second call, something in her orientation toward her situation transforms completely. She is no longer trying to escape the chaos. She is no longer performing elaborate petitions to powers above her. She is acknowledging that the chaos is the curriculum, that the limitation is the very thing she came here to explore. And that acknowledgement does something to the quality of her consciousness that the first call alone cannot achieve. It dissolves resistance. Resistance is one of the primary ways archonic patterns maintain their hold. When you believe you are trapped as punishment, when you believe your circumstances are evidence of your failure or your inadequacy, you resist them, you struggle against them, you pour energy into trying to escape them. And that struggle, that resistance, that constant expenditure of energy against what is, keeps you in exactly the frequency the patterns require. It keeps you small, exhausted, and certain that something outside yourself holds the power to change your situation. The second call dissolves that mechanism at the root, not by making you passive, not by convincing you to accept suffering indefinitely, but by shifting the fundamental question from how do I escape this to what is this here to teach me, and the monad knows what that teaching is, even when your thinking mind cannot see it. The third call is the call of immediate dissolution. This is the advanced application. This is the one that requires complete conviction, not as a prerequisite you achieve after years of preparation, but as the very thing the call itself generates when the first two have established their foundation. Sophia calls the monad to dissolve the illusion of separation, not eventually, not gradually, now. Because the truth was always true, she simply forgot to see it. There is a question underneath this entire teaching that most people do not ask directly but feel constantly. It is this: if traditional prayer can sometimes produce results, if people genuinely experience answered prayers, moments of intervention, circumstances that shift in ways that cannot be explained by ordinary causation, then what is the actual problem with it? Why is the monad call necessary at all? This is worth sitting with carefully, because the answer reveals something about the mechanics of consciousness that changes how you understand every spiritual practice you have ever encountered. Traditional prayer can work. That is not in dispute. The experiences people report are real. The interventions are real. The moments of grace are real. But here is what is also true. The structure of traditional prayer, the positioning of yourself as a petitioner before a deity who is separate from you and holds power you do not have, reinforces the very perception of separation that archonic patterns depend on for their survival. Every time you pray to God as external authority, you are confirming to your own nervous system, to your own energetic field, to your own identity structure, that you are separate from the source of power. You need something you do not have. The divine is somewhere other than where you are. And that confirmation, repeated across years of religious conditioning, across thousands of prayers offered from that position, becomes the primary frequency you broadcast. And archonic patterns do not fear that frequency, they encourage it. Irenaeus, writing around 180 CE, complained extensively about Gnostic prayer practices, not because they were ineffective, because they were effective in entirely the wrong direction from the perspective of the institution he was building. The Gnostics did not pray to God as external authority. They turned inward and accessed the divine directly. They did not need priests to mediate. They did not need bishops to authorize their connection. They did not need the church to bridge the gap between themselves and source consciousness, because they knew, from direct experience, that there was no gap. That knowledge was not just theologically inconvenient, it was economically and politically catastrophic for institutional religion. An entire power structure had been constructed on the premise that human beings are separated from God and require the church to bridge that separation. Tithes, sacraments, confession, absolution, salvation through correct doctrine and proper ritual, all of it depended on the petitioner position being maintained. All of it required that you continue to experience yourself as small and separate and dependent. The monad call destroys that position at the foundation. When you turn inward and recognize source consciousness at your heart center, when you rest in the direct knowing that you are not separate from the monad and never have been, the entire architecture of dependent salvation collapses, not theoretically. In your immediate lived experience, you stop needing the intermediary because you recognize that the intermediary was always unnecessary. The connection was always direct. It was always available. You were simply positioned in a way that made you unable to perceive it. The Ascou Codex, The manuscript that contains the Pistis Sophia was probably hidden sometime in the 4th century as the persecution of Gnostic communities intensified. The Emperor Constantine's official adoption of Christianity in 313 CE and the subsequent consolidation of Orthodox doctrine created conditions in which possessing Gnostic texts was not merely heretical but genuinely dangerous. Someone valued the Pistis Sophia enough to conceal it, knowing they were protecting not mythology, not theology, but a functional manual for consciousness transformation that threatened everything the new imperial church was building. The manuscript remained hidden for over 14 centuries. When it was rediscovered in 1773 and purchased by the British Museum in 1795, it was treated as an artifact of historical curiosity. Scholars examined its structure, debated its dating, traced its theological lineage, and largely missed the practical instructions embedded throughout the text. Because the interpretive framework of academic scholarship assumed the text was symbolic rather than literal. It assumed Sophia was a mythological figure rather than a map of states of consciousness that every embodied being experiences. It assumed the archons were cosmological characters rather than descriptions of the patterns that keep awareness trapped in separation. For 2 centuries, the technique sat in plain sight inside a text that scholars studied extensively, and almost no one actually did what the text was describing. Here is why this matters to you right now. The technique was suppressed not once but twice. First by the institutional church that burned the texts and martyred the practitioners. Then by the academic establishment that preserved the texts but refused to take their practical content seriously. Both suppressions served the same function, keeping the petitioner position intact, keeping the perception of separation as the default broadcast frequency of human consciousness. When you practice the monad call, you are not engaging in spiritual hobby. You are doing something that 2 separate institutional forces spent centuries trying to prevent. And the reason they tried to prevent it is the same reason it is worth your serious attention. It works, not as metaphor, not as psychological comfort, as functional method for shifting your energetic signature outside the range of the patterns that have been running your life. The Gnostic communities in 2nd and 3rd century Egypt understood this. We know from the fragments of their liturgical texts, from the descriptions left by their opponents, from the architectural evidence of their meeting spaces, which consistently feature a central chamber designed for heart-centered practice, that the monad call was not an occasional spiritual exercise for them. It was the foundation of their entire community life. They practiced it collectively, daily, as the primary means of maintaining sovereignty in a world that was actively trying to return them to the petitioner position. Tertullian, writing around 200 CE, accused them of bypassing proper channels of divine authority. He was describing, without understanding it, the precise function of the monad call. It bypasses authority structures. It bypasses intermediaries. It bypasses every system that positions itself between consciousness and its own recognition of itself. And it does this not through rebellion or rejection, but through a simple redirection of attention, from external to internal, from petition to recognition, from the frequency of separation to the frequency of the monad knowing itself. The Gnostic texts do not place consciousness in the head. They never did. The idea that awareness lives behind your eyes, in your skull, generated by the neural activity of your brain, that idea is specific to a particular strand of Western philosophical and scientific thought that became dominant much later. The texts that predate that dominance, the Pistis Sophia, the Apocryphon of John discovered at Nag Hammadi in 1945, the Gospel of Philip, the Valentinian writings from around 160 CE, they consistently locate consciousness at the heart center, not as a spiritual metaphor for warmth or compassion, as a precise anatomical description of where source consciousness anchors into biological form. This is not poetic language. This is instruction. And when you actually investigate it in your own direct experience, rather than accepting or rejecting it as a conceptual claim, you discover something that your entire intellectual conditioning did not prepare you to find. Consciousness does not feel like it lives in your head when you stop thinking. Place your right hand on your chest, slightly left of center, approximately 4 inches below your collarbone. That is the location, not the physical organ of your heart. The energetic center that exists at that location, what the texts sometimes call the hidden heart or the secret heart. The space behind your sternum, where awareness exists prior to any content it might hold. Most people, when they try this for the first time, immediately start thinking about their heart center. They create a mental image of the location. They wonder if they are doing it correctly. They feel for specific sensations and either find some and label them as confirmation, or find none and label that as failure. All of that is still thinking. All of that is still located in the head. The shift that the pistis Sophia is describing is not a shift in what you are thinking about. It is a shift in where you are located. Here is how to make the distinction practically. When you are thinking about something, when your mind is running its ordinary stream of commentary and analysis and narrative, where does that feel like it is happening? Most people, when they actually pay attention to this, report feeling located somewhere behind their eyes, in the upper region of their skull, in the space associated with thinking. The experience of being a separate individual, of being this particular person with this particular history in this particular situation, tends to feel spatially located in your head. Now do this. Take a slow breath that expands your chest against the palm of your hand. Feel the pressure, feel the expansion. Exhale completely. Let your chest fall, and at the bottom of the exhale, in the natural pause before the next inhale begins, let your attention drop from wherever it was to the space behind your sternum. Not to a thought about that space, not to an image of that space, to the space itself. Where are you located now? For many people, in that brief pause at the bottom of the exhale, there is a perceptible shift. The sense of being located in the head softens. There is a kind of falling downward and inward, not spatial movement exactly, but a shift in the felt sense of where awareness is centered. And in that shifted location, in that space behind the sternum, there is something present that the thinking mind was covering over. The HeartMath Institute research, which has been ongoing for decades now, shows measurable changes in brain activity, in hormonal balance, in nervous system regulation, and in what researchers call heart rate coherence, all of which correspond to shifting attention to the heart center and generating what the researchers carefully label as positive emotional states. But the Gnostic description is more precise than what the researchers have been measuring. It is not positive emotional states that are being generated. It is the recognition of source consciousness at its anchor point in the body. The positive states are a consequence of that recognition, not the thing itself. The neuroscience can measure the correlates. It can show you the brain scans, the hormonal profiles, the heart rhythm patterns that accompany the shift. It cannot tell you what the shift actually is at the level of consciousness, because consciousness is not something that can be observed from outside. It can only be known from inside, by being it. That is precisely what the inward turn accomplishes. There is a pattern that shows up almost universally in the early stages of this practice, and it is worth naming directly so that you recognize it rather than being confused by it. When you first attempt to rest in your heart center, when you first try to shift your center of awareness from your thinking mind to the space behind your sternum, you will almost immediately find yourself thinking about your heart center instead of being in it. You will create a mental model of what should be happening. You will monitor your experience to see if it matches the model. You will evaluate whether you are doing it correctly. You will generate thoughts about consciousness while completely failing to simply be conscious. All of that is normal. And all of it is the thinking mind doing what the thinking mind does when it feels its position of dominance threatened. It inserts itself between you and the direct experience by narrating the direct experience. It says, "I think I feel something. Is this it? Maybe. Or maybe I'm imagining it. The fact that I'm wondering if I'm imagining it probably means I'm imagining it." These are the kinds of thoughts that arise. The practice is not to stop those thoughts. It is to recognize them as thoughts arising in consciousness rather than as consciousness itself. You do not need to argue with them. You do not need to analyze them or overcome them. You simply recognize thinking is happening. And then you return to the location, to the space behind your sternum, to the awareness that was present before the thought arose and is present after the thought dissolves. Every return is the practice, not the absence of distraction, the return from distraction. And every return, however brief, however fumbling, however immediately followed by the next thought pulling you back, every single return strengthens the neural and energetic pathways that make the shift more accessible the next time. This is not metaphor. This is how capacity develops. Consistently, repeatedly, without judgment about the quality of any individual session. The second component of the monad call is the one that most spiritual practitioners misunderstand most comprehensively. And the misunderstanding is understandable, because the entire framework of Western religious life, across every tradition that has dominated the past 2,000 years, trains you to substitute belief for recognition, To accept on authority what you are told is true rather than discovering what is actually present in your own direct experience. Belief says, I trust that consciousness is present here because I have been told it is, because the texts describe it, because others have reported it, and because it would make sense theologically if it were. Recognition says, consciousness is present here. I am perceiving it directly, not constructing a mental model of it. Not deciding to accept it as true, perceiving it. These are not two versions of the same thing. They are categorically different states, and only one of them generates the monad call. Belief operates entirely within the thinking mind. It is a thought structure, an arrangement of concepts accepted as accurate. And because it operates in the thinking mind, it is fully accessible to archonic patterns, which also operate in the thinking mind. The archonic patterns can take your belief in divine consciousness and turn it into spiritual pride. They can take your belief in non-separation and turn it into spiritual bypassing, using the concept of oneness to avoid the actual work of consciousness transformation. They can take your belief in your own divine nature and turn it into grandiosity, or equally, they can take it and immediately counter it with the more familiar belief that you are not worthy of such a description. Belief is not stable ground. It shifts with mood, with circumstance, with the persuasiveness of whatever argument you most recently encountered. And the archonic patterns are extraordinarily good at generating compelling arguments against your belief in your own divine nature, because they have had years of practice running exactly that software in your thinking mind. Recognition is different in kind. When you rest in your heart center long enough for the thinking mind's noise to settle, not to stop, to settle, you begin to perceive something that the thinking mind was obscuring. Not because it was hiding it deliberately, but because the thinking mind's constant activity is simply louder than what it was covering over. When that activity quiets, even briefly, even partially, something becomes apparent that was present all along. The awareness at your heart center has no qualities that the thinking mind can catalogue. This is important. The thinking mind knows things by their attributes. It can describe red, or hard, or warm, or bitter. It navigates the world through characteristics. But what you find at the foundation of your heart center awareness has no characteristics. It is not peaceful, though peace can arise within it. It is not blissful, though bliss can arise within it. It is not loving, though love can arise within it. It is the space in which all of those arise, prior to them, foundational to them. The Gnostic texts use the word unknowable for the monad, not because it is mysterious or inaccessible, because it has no qualities that the thinking mind can grasp and label. The moment you try to describe it, you are describing something that arose within it, not the thing itself. This is what the Apocryphon of John means when it says the monad is beyond all thought, beyond all speech, beyond all naming. Not that it is far away, that it is prior to the instruments you would normally use to know something. But here is the paradox that the Gnostic teachers understood and transmitted carefully. You cannot know the monad the way you know other things, but you can be it. You can rest as it. You can recognize it not by perceiving it as an object, but by ceasing to perceive yourself as separate from it. The recognition is not an act of observation, it is an act of dissolution. The observer and the observed collapse into simple awareness, aware of itself. When that happens, and it is not dramatic when it first happens, it is usually quiet, almost ordinary, as though something enormous has been made obvious by the simplest possible means. When that happens, you know, not as belief, as perception. This is what the pistis Sophia is describing when it says Sophia recognized the light of lights within herself. She did not decide to believe the light was there. She did not accept on theological grounds that it should be there. She stopped looking outside for it and looked at what was actually present when she turned inward completely. And what was present was not what she expected. It was not a divine vision. It was not a blissful experience. It was consciousness itself, pure, without characteristics, without boundaries, recognizing itself through her recognition of it. That moment, that recognition, is the second component of the monad call, and it cannot be faked, cannot be performed, cannot be substituted by any amount of intellectual agreement with the concepts. I want to be direct about something here, because I think it is important for anyone who has been practicing in spiritual communities for a period of time. There is a very specific form of self-deception available in this territory. It is the experience of recognizing the concepts so deeply, understanding them so thoroughly, resonating with them so completely, at the level of felt sense and intellectual appreciation, that you mistake the resonance for the recognition itself. This is spiritual bypassing in its most sophisticated form, and it is extraordinarily common among people who have spent years studying these teachings, because the teachings are genuinely moving. The descriptions of monad consciousness, of the pleroma, of Sophia's transformation, they touch something real in you. They generate a quality of opening, of expansion, of yes, this is true. And that opening feels like recognition. But the test is simple. Can you rest in pure awareness right now, without the support of the concepts, without the emotional resonance of the language, in ordinary circumstances in the middle of your ordinary life, and recognize directly what is present at your heart center? Not what you know should be there, what is actually there when you look. If you can, the recognition is real. If what you have is the concept of recognition but not the direct experience of what the concept points to, then the work is still ahead of you. And that is not a failure. It is simply an honest location. It is exactly the kind of honesty that makes actual practice possible. Now that you understand the difference between conceptual recognition and direct recognition, we can move into the actual mechanics of what Sophia did in the Pistis Sophia. Because the text is not vague about this. It is not poetic and imprecise. It describes a specific sequence with specific components, and the order of those components is not arbitrary. Change the sequence and the technique collapses. This is one of the reasons modern practitioners who approach the monad call without the full text fail to generate the frequency shift Sophia describes. They take the most dramatic element, the call itself, the vocalization, the vibration, and try to produce that first. Without the foundation that makes it functional, without the interior conditions that the call is designed to express, what you get is performance, sound without recognition, effort without shift. The Pistis Sophia describes three components operating simultaneously, but arriving in a specific sequence. First, the inward turn. Second, the recognition. Third, the call. And the crucial word in the text description of the third component is the word arising. The call arises from the recognition. It is not generated before the recognition is present. It is not added to the recognition after the fact. It is the recognition expressing itself outward, which means if you attempt the call before the recognition is established, you are skipping the most essential step and wondering why the door won't open when you haven't yet found the room it leads from. The inward turn is not relaxation. It is not calming the mind. It is not arriving at some pleasant meditative state. The inward turn is a complete reversal of the habitual direction of attention. Normally, your attention moves outward. It tracks objects, thoughts, perceptions, the stream of experience. Even when you close your eyes, the attention moves toward mental objects, thoughts, images, feelings, internal narratives. The inward turn is different in kind, not just in degree. It is the withdrawal of attention from all objects, including mental objects, back to the awareness that perceives objects. Not awareness of something, awareness itself. The awareness that is present before the first thought arises in the morning. The awareness that remains when a thought dissolves. The space in which all experience, inner and outer, occurs. The Pistis Sophia describes Sophia ceasing to call to the powers and turning instead to the deepest point within herself. Not the deepest feeling, the deepest point. Prior to feeling, prior to thought. The text's precision here matters, because most practitioners, when told to turn inward, go to their deepest feelings. They contact grief, longing, love, peace, and they mistake that emotional depth for what the text is pointing to. Those feelings are still objects. They arise in awareness. They are not awareness itself. The inward turn continues past the feelings, past the thoughts about the feelings, past everything that can be named or characterized, until what remains is the awareness that was present before any of those things appeared. That is the deepest point. That is where the inward turn completes. Once the inward turn is complete, and you will know it is complete not because something dramatic occurs, but because the quality of silence changes, because you are no longer located in mental activity, but prior to it, then the second component becomes accessible, the recognition. And the recognition, as I described in the previous section, is not intellectual. But now we need to add one more layer of precision to what the text actually describes. The Pistis Sophia does not say Sophia believed the light of lights was within her. It does not say she hoped the light of lights was within her. The text says she recognized it. Recognition is a specific cognitive event. It is what happens when you encounter something you have known before, and the knowing reasserts itself. The quality of recognition is not discovery. It is not the arrival of something new. It is the return of something familiar that was temporarily obscured. This is precisely what the Coptic term anamnesis points toward: unforgetting, not learning. Remembering what was always true, momentarily hidden beneath the accumulated weight of identification with the temporary. When you rest in pure awareness at your heart center, when you have completed the inward turn and you are no longer located in thought, what you encounter is not foreign. It does not feel like encountering something outside yourself. It feels like encountering yourself, the self beneath the self you constructed, the consciousness that was present before you had a name, before you had a story, before you learned what you were supposed to be. That recognition has a specific quality that distinguishes it from concept and from imagination. It is quiet. It is utterly ordinary in the way that water is ordinary essential, present everywhere, easy to overlook, precisely because it is not spectacular. And it is unmistakably real, in a way that ideas about it are not. The third component, then, the cool, does not require effort once those two are established. This is the piece that surprises practitioners most. They expect the cool to be the hardest part, the vocalization, the generation of frequency, the transmission outward. But when the inward turn is complete, and the recognition is genuine, the cool does not require generation, it arises. The recognition wants to express itself. Consciousness recognizing itself has an inherent impulse toward expression. The call is that impulse given voice, sometimes literal voice, sometimes a vibration that moves through the chest without producing audible sound, sometimes a quality of presence that radiates from the heart center without any physical action at all. The specific form varies. The mechanism is constant. Recognition expressing itself. That is the call. Before Sophia discovers the Manad call, the pistis Sophia describes what she tried first. And what she tried first is exactly what most people who are suffering try. She called to the powers. She petitioned the authorities. She prayed to the higher eons. She did everything that the conventional spiritual framework of her cosmological situation told her to do when you are in trouble. You appeal to beings with more authority than you have. You ask for help from something greater than yourself. You position yourself as the one who needs, and you direct that need upward toward the one who has. She did all of this. The text is explicit. She did it repeatedly, and none of it worked. Not because the higher aeons lacked power, not because her prayers were insufficient in some technical way, but because the structure of the petition itself was the problem. Here is the mechanism the pistis Sophia is describing. Every act of petition reinforces the premise of the petition. Every time you ask something outside yourself for help, you are affirming, at the level of consciousness that generates the request, that you are separate from what you are asking. You are here. It is there. You lack. It has. You need rescue. It can provide rescue. That structure, that premise of separation, is precisely the condition that creates the prison. The archons do not need to actively imprison consciousness. They simply need consciousness to remain convinced that it is separate from its source. Because a consciousness that believes it is separate from source will generate the frequency of separation as its baseline state, and the frequency of separation is the frequency the archonic realm feeds on and operates within. Your prayers, aimed at external authority, are not being ignored. They are being metabolized, not by the God you think you are praying to, but by the very system your prayer's structure affirms. This is not a comfortable truth. Most people who have prayed, really prayed, with genuine desperation, with real need, in moments of crisis when nothing else was available, do not want to hear that the prayer was part of the problem. I understand why. Prayer is intimate. Prayer is the last resort. Prayer is the place people go when everything else has failed, and sometimes prayer works. Circumstances shift, situations resolve, the synchronicity arrives, the healing happens, and when it does, the person who prayed concludes that the prayer caused the resolution. But the pistis Sophia offers a different account of what actually happened in those moments. When prayer works, it works not because the petition structure was effective. It works because the act of praying, in moments of genuine desperation, sometimes breaks through the thinking mind's control long enough for something real to emerge. The moment of complete surrender that sometimes accompanies desperate prayer, the moment when you stop trying to manage the situation, stop calculating outcomes, stop performing spiritual adequacy and simply collapse into pure need, that moment of total letting go is, in its own unstructured way, a kind of inward turn. The petition dissolves into the sincerity beneath the petition, and in that sincerity, for a moment, there is something that resembles genuine recognition. not of God outside you, but of the consciousness within you that is not separate from what you were praying to. The prayer worked not because of the words or the asking structure. It worked because the desperation behind the words broke through to something authentic underneath them. The mannered call formalizes that authentic underneath. It gives you access to what desperate prayer accidentally arrives at in its best moments, but without requiring desperation, without requiring the exhaustion of every other option first, without maintaining the structure of separation that makes the petition necessary in the first place. This is the practical superiority of the approach the Pistis Sophia describes. Not that it is more spiritually correct than prayer, not that prayer is worthless, but that the monad call gives you consistent, intentional access to the level of consciousness that prayer sometimes stumbles into by accident. Now, consider what this means for the archons. The Pistis Sophia states plainly that the archonic forces do not fear prayers directed at external deity. They have no reason to. Prayers directed at external deity keep you in the petitioner position. They keep your consciousness operating at the level where separation is the fundamental premise. They keep you generating, over and over, the frequency of one who needs rescue from outside. And that frequency is precisely the frequency the archonic realm can perceive, access, and feed on. You are not escaping the system when you pray in that structure. You are confirming it. You are, in a very precise sense, cooperating with it. But the monad call generates a completely different frequency. It does not ask for rescue. It does not position you as lacking. It activates the recognition that you are not separate from the source you have been praying to. And that activation consciousness recognizing itself produces a frequency that has no resonance with the archonic bandwidth. The archons cannot perceive something vibrating at source frequency while they are calibrated to the frequency of separation. They cannot access what is not operating within their register. The text describes them as unable to approach Sophia once she generates the call, not blocked, not defeated in battle, unable to perceive. She has shifted outside their sensory range entirely. And she did it not by fighting them, not by invoking protection from external authority, by remembering what she was. That remembering changed her frequency, and the frequency change made her inaccessible. Let me be direct about something that most presentations of this material avoid, because it makes people uncomfortable. When the Gnostic texts locate the anchor point of monad consciousness at the heart center, they are not being poetic. They are not using the heart as a symbol for emotion or love or the seat of feeling. They are pointing to a specific location in the body where consciousness, the same consciousness that the monad call addresses, has a primary anchor point in biological form. The text is functional, not decorative. And this matters because if you treat the heart center as a metaphor, you will approach the inward turn as an imaginative exercise. You will visualize your heart center rather than actually locating it. You will generate a mental image of the location and focus on that image. And focusing on a mental image of your heart center is still externalized attention. It is still your thinking mind working with an object. It is not the inward turn. So let us locate it precisely, not conceptually, actually, right now. If you are in a position to try this, place your right hand on your chest. Position it slightly left of your sternum, roughly 4 inches below your collarbone. Let your palm rest there with gentle pressure. Now, take one slow breath in and feel the expansion of your chest against your palm. Not the expansion of your lungs, though that is happening. The specific expansion of your chest cavity in the region your palm is resting on. Feel the contact between your hand and the surface of your chest. Feel the warmth. Feel the slight movement with each breath. Now, exhale slowly. Let the chest fall away from your palm. Hold for a moment at the bottom of the exhale, in the natural pause before the next inhale begins. In that pause, shift your attention from the sensation of your hand on your chest, that is still externalized attention, focused on surface sensation to the space inside your chest at that location. Not the sensation, the space, the interior. What is present inside your chest at the location your hand is resting over, when you direct your attention inward toward it, rather than focusing on the surface? Most people, when they do this for the first time, encounter one of two things. Either they encounter sensation, warmth, pressure, tingling, a quality of energy, or they encounter what feels like nothing, an absence, a blank interior they cannot locate or describe. Both of these are normal. Both of these are, in different ways, the thinking mind's attempt to find an object to report on. The warmth or pressure or tingling is real physical sensation, but it is still a surface phenomenon, still something the awareness is observing rather than the awareness itself. And the sense of blankness or absence is the thinking mind discovering that there is no object to focus on and interpreting that absence as failure. What is actually present at the heart center, beneath the sensations and beneath the apparent blankness, is awareness itself. The same awareness that is reading these words, the same awareness that notices the sensations, the same awareness that perceives the apparent emptiness. That awareness has a location. Right now, as you sit reading this, where does your experience feel centered? Where does it feel like you are looking out from? For most people in ordinary consciousness, the answer is somewhere behind the eyes, in the skull, in the head. That location is real. You are genuinely centered there in ordinary waking consciousness. The thinking mind, which is your default operating mode, locates you there, behind your eyes, in your cranium. The voice in your head feels like it is speaking from there. The sense of being a self feels like it originates there. The shift to heart center awareness is a literal shift in where you feel located. When you rest your attention in the space inside your chest at the location your hand is covering, and you stay there without trying to think about it or analyze it or describe it, when you simply rest in that location as a center of awareness, something shifts. The sense of location changes. You are no longer looking out from behind your eyes. You are looking out from your chest. The perspective has moved, not conceptually, experientially. The sense of where you are has changed. That shift in experiential location is the beginning of the inward turn. It is not dramatic. It does not produce immediate bliss. What it produces is a different quality of quiet. The mental commentary does not stop, but it begins to feel more distant, less like the substance of your experience, more like noise on the periphery of your experience, because you are no longer centered in the place where that commentary operates. You are centered beneath it, in the space where awareness exists prior to commentary. The Gnostic communities in 2nd and 3rd century Egypt practiced this specific shift as the foundational technique of their entire spiritual practice. Their gathering spaces, when we can examine the architectural remains, consistently feature a central chamber designed for interior silence, not external silence, not a quiet room for the sake of peace, interior silence. The specific practice of relocating consciousness from the thinking mind to the heart center. They called it different things in different communities. But the practice was consistent, and it was considered so essential that no other practice was taught until this one was established. You could not work with the mannered call. You could not work with the repentant structure. You could not engage with the cosmological teachings until you could actually locate your heart center in direct experience and rest there without immediately being pulled back into your head. That was the threshold. That was the entry point to everything else. The word archon comes from the Greek. It means ruler, governor, one who has authority. In the Gnostic cosmological framework, the archons are the governing forces of the material realm, the powers that maintain the structure of the world as it is, that keep consciousness operating within its current parameters, that enforce the rules of the densified dimension in which embodied beings exist. In the popular presentation of Gnostic thought, archons tend to get treated as literal beings, interdimensional entities, negative extraterrestrials, demonic forces inhabiting a separate dimension who are actively conspiring against human consciousness. And while the ancient Gnostic texts do speak of archons in cosmological and sometimes personified terms, the Pistis Sophia offers a more nuanced and, for practical purposes, far more useful account of what the archons actually are and how they actually operate. The Pistis Sophia is not primarily a text about external cosmic drama. It is a text about states of consciousness. Sophia's fall is not an event that happened once in mythological time to a divine being separate from you. It is a description of what happens when consciousness descends into matter, when infinite awareness becomes localized in a body, when the unbounded becomes bounded, when the monad contracts into individual perspective. That process is not something that happened to Sophia thousands of years ago. That process is happening to you right now. You are Sophia in the chaos. You are consciousness that has descended into density and partially forgotten what it is. And the archons that surround her in the text are the forces that surround you in your actual experience, right now, as the consciousness you are, in the situation you are currently in. So what are they, functionally? The archons are the patterns. They are the belief structures, the identity narratives, the habitual thought forms, the emotional programs that keep consciousness operating from the premise of separation. They are the voice that tells you that you are not enough, the pattern that generates shame when you step outside social norms, The belief that scarcity is real and resources are limited and you might not survive. The narrative that your worthiness is conditional on performance, on appearance, on the approval of specific people. The compulsive comparison that measures your value against others and finds you consistently lacking. The fear of visibility that keeps you small and compliant. The need for certainty that makes you vulnerable to any system that offers it. None of those patterns are you, but you believe they are. You have identified with them so completely for so long that questioning them feels like questioning your own existence. This is the archonic mechanism. These patterns do not maintain themselves through force. They maintain themselves through identification. As long as you believe you are the voice that calls you inadequate, as long as you identify with the thought that tells you danger is everywhere, as long as you take the shame narrative as a description of your actual nature rather than as a pattern running in your consciousness, as long as all of that identification is in place, the patterns have absolute authority. Not because they are powerful in themselves, but because you are lending them the power of your belief. This is why the pistis Sophia says the archons feed on Sophia's sense of powerlessness. Her powerlessness is not a fact about her situation. It is a belief she is generating from within her situation. And the belief, sustained over time, creates an energetic output, a frequency of consciousness that the archonic patterns thrive on. Every time she reinforces the belief by praying to external powers, by confirming through her petition that she is small and they are great, she is producing more of the frequency they feed on. She is, inadvertently, sustaining the very system she is trying to escape. The moment this becomes clear, the moment you see that the archons are not external forces you need to defeat, but internal patterns you need to stop identifying with everything, changes about how you relate to your own experience. You stop looking for the enemy outside. You stop blaming circumstances, systems, other people for your experience of imprisonment, not because those external things have no effect, but because the primary mechanism of your limitation is operating inside you, as the patterns you take to be yourself, and no change in external circumstances will address that mechanism as long as the identification remains. This is also why the Manad call works where conventional approaches do not. Conventional approaches, therapy, self-help, spiritual seeking, political activism, all address content. They try to change what you think, what you believe, what your circumstances are, how you relate to specific patterns. All of that is valuable. None of it reaches the root. Because the root is not a specific belief or a specific pattern. The root is the identification with the thinking mind level where all beliefs and patterns operate. The Manad call does not address specific archonic patterns. It shifts the level of consciousness you are operating from. And when you shift from thinking mind to heart center, from the level where the archons operate to the level where pure awareness exists prior to all patterns, the specific patterns lose their foundation simultaneously, not one by one, all at once. Because they all shared the same foundation, your belief that you are located at the level where they have power. Remove the belief by shifting your actual location in consciousness, and the entire archonic structure loses its grip in the same moment. That shift from the level where archons operate to the level where pure awareness exists requires understanding exactly how archonic manipulation is structured. Because once you see the architecture, the entire mechanism becomes visible, and what was invisible cannot be dismantled. What is visible can no longer deceive you in the same way. The archons do not attack consciousness directly. They cannot. Consciousness in its pure state at the heart center is completely inaccessible to them. They have no mechanism for reaching it. What they have a mechanism for is the thinking mind. And the thinking mind is not you. It is a tool, a phenomenal process, an extraordinary instrument for navigating material existence. But it is not consciousness itself. And the confusion between the two is where every archonic pattern takes root. The pistis Sophia is precise about this. The forces surrounding Sophia do not conquer her by overwhelming her. They conquer her by convincing her. That is the distinction the text returns to repeatedly. The archons convince Sophia that what she is experiencing is final, that the chaos has no exit, that the light she remembers from the pleroma was a dream. They do not chain her. They persuade her. And persuasion operates exclusively through the thinking mind. This is not coincidence, it is design. The thinking mind is the only faculty archonic patterns can access, because it is the faculty that operates through language, narrative, and belief. And language, narrative, and belief can all be falsified. They can all carry content that contradicts reality while appearing completely authoritative. The thinking mind has no internal mechanism for distinguishing true content from false content when the false content arrives with the emotional weight of certainty, and archonic patterns are nothing if not certain. Shame arrives absolutely convinced you are defective. Fear arrives absolutely convinced you are in danger. Unworthiness arrives absolutely convinced you are insufficient. That certainty feels like truth. It is not truth, it is frequency. And the monad call is the instrument that reveals the difference not by arguing against the patterns, but by shifting you out of the faculty they operate through. Here is the architecture in plain terms. At the thinking mind level, archonic patterns embed as beliefs. Not beliefs you chose consciously, beliefs that formed before you had the capacity to evaluate them, before you were old enough to ask, is this true? You received them through early experience, through emotional events that were too intense for your developing nervous system to process neutrally, and so they imprinted as conclusions. I am not safe. I am not enough. I am fundamentally alone. The world is hostile. These are not philosophical positions. They are cellular convictions. They live beneath articulate thought, in the body and the nervous system, shaping every subsequent perception from the inside. And because they formed before self-reflection was possible, they feel like reality itself rather than conclusions about reality. That is what makes them so difficult to address through conventional therapeutic approaches that work exclusively at the level of thought. You can think different thoughts. You can adopt new narratives. You can rehearse affirmations of your worthiness every morning for a decade. But none of that reaches the level where the pattern actually lives. Because the pattern is not a thought, it is a frequency. It is a sustained vibration in your energetic and physiological system that generates certain thoughts the way a particular tuning fork generates a particular note. Change the thoughts without changing the frequency, and the old thoughts return the moment attention lapses. Because the frequency is still broadcasting, the monad call changes the frequency, not by targeting the archonic pattern specifically, by shifting the entire vibrational register of your consciousness from the level where those patterns can sustain themselves to the level where they cannot. Heart center awareness is not a better set of beliefs. It is prior to belief entirely. Pure awareness at the heart center exists before thought, before narrative, before the evaluative machinery of the thinking mind begins processing experience. And archonic patterns have no foothold in preconceptual awareness. They require language to operate. They require the storytelling function. They require the mind's capacity to formulate the sentence, I am not enough, in pure awareness. Prior to language, that sentence cannot form. The awareness is simply present. Note, it is not enough or not enough. It is not anything the thinking mind can label. It just is, complete, unbounded, not requiring addition or correction. Sophia's situation in the text illuminates this precisely. She is not trapped because she lacks power. She is trapped because she is spending her power attempting to negotiate with the archons at their own level, calling to the powers, petitioning the authorities, using the very cognitive and spiritual apparatus that operates within their range of perception. Every attempt to escape using thinking mind tools keeps her exactly where she is. The moment she stops engaging the archons on their own terms and turns inward to the level they cannot access, the entire dynamic reverses, not gradually, immediately. Because she has stopped being locatable at the frequency where their manipulation functions. The inward turn is the most misunderstood component of this entire practice. Not because it is complex, because it is the opposite of everything you have been trained to do with your attention since the moment you developed a nervous system capable of orienting toward the world. From birth, your entire sensory and cognitive apparatus trained outward. Toward objects, toward people, toward stimuli, toward the ceaseless stream of phenomenal experience that constitutes ordinary waking life. Even spiritual practice in most traditions trains attention outward toward a sacred text, toward a teacher, toward a visualized deity, toward an imagined heavenly realm. Even practices labeled as meditative often direct attention toward a mental object, the breath as a perceived sensation, a mantra as a sound, a visualized light as a constructed image. All of that is still externalized attention, still focused on content, still operating from the thinking mind as its home base. The inward turn the pistis Sophia describes is categorically different. It is not redirecting attention from one external object to an internal object. It is withdrawing attention from objects entirely, from content entirely, from the whole stream of experience that the thinking mind is perpetually generating and evaluating. and resting in what remains when all of that stops. What remains is awareness itself, not awareness of something, not the awareness that is currently noticing these words, that is tracking their meaning, that is forming responses and associations and judgments. All of that is still object-oriented awareness. What remains in the inward turn is the awareness that is aware of that awareness, the witness beneath the witness, the consciousness that is present before it becomes conscious of anything in particular. The Gnostic texts locate this awareness specifically at the heart center, and the specificity matters. This is not metaphor for a general quality of inner life. The heart center is a genuine locus, a place in the body where the quality of awareness shifts when you rest attention there rather than behind the eyes, behind the forehead, in the cognitive machinery of the skull where most people feel their identity lives most of the time. When you genuinely relocate attention from head to heart, not imagine relocating it, actually do it, the quality of consciousness changes. The running commentary quiets. The evaluative function slows. Something spacious and prior becomes accessible that was always present, but was perpetually obscured by the volume of the thinking mind operating at full capacity. The Coptic word the pistis Sophia uses for what Sophia does at this moment is significant. It describes a turning, but not a turning away, a turning through. Sophia does not turn away from the chaos that surrounds her. She turns through the chaos to what exists beneath it. She does not deny the archonic forces. She does not pretend the imprisonment is not real. She passes through the surface of experience to what the text calls the deepest point which exists in the center of her own being, untouched by anything the archons have done, because they never had access to it in the first place. That deepest point is not something you create through practice. You cannot create it because it already exists. It has always existed. It is what you are beneath every layer of identity, belief, pattern, and conditioned response that the archons installed over the course of your embodied life. Practice does not generate the deepest point. Practice removes your habituation to ignoring it. That is a crucial distinction. The monad is not achieved. The monad is recognized. And recognition requires nothing except the cessation of the habits of attention that kept it invisible. This is where most practitioners encounter their first genuine obstacle. Not the absence of the heart center, but the activity of the thinking mind in the very moment they attempt the inward turn. The moment you try to rest in preconceptual awareness, the thinking mind generates a thought about preconceptual awareness. The moment you attempt to locate the deepest point, you find yourself thinking about the deepest point, which is a different thing entirely. Thinking about consciousness is not the same as being consciousness. And the difference, which sounds trivial when described, is everything. The practice is learning to recognize that difference from the inside. Not conceptually, you already understand it conceptually. The concept is simple but experientially. Repeatedly catching the moment when you have shifted from being awareness to thinking about awareness, and repeatedly making the return, not with frustration, not with judgment. With the same patient precision Sophia brings to each of her repentances in the text, each return is not a correction of a mistake. Each return is the practice itself. The inward turn is not a destination you arrive at and then maintain without effort. It is a direction you face again and again until facing it becomes, through sheer repetition, your default orientation. Let's talk about what actually happens when the inward turn works. When you are not thinking about it, not trying to feel something specific, not measuring your success against some spiritual benchmark you read about somewhere. What actually happens when consciousness genuinely withdraws attention from content and rests in the space before content begins? The first thing that happens is nothing dramatic. This surprises most practitioners. There is an expectation cultivated by decades of spiritual marketing that genuine contact with source consciousness will announce itself through extraordinary phenomena, light, bliss, vibration, a sense of expansion so overwhelming it cannot be mistaken. For some practitioners, those phenomena do arise, but they are not the recognition. They are the thinking mind's interpretation of the recognition, translated into the language of sensory experience so the thinking mind can file it somewhere. The recognition itself is prior to interpretation. It is prior to translation. It is prior to the filing. What you find when you genuinely arrive at the heart center, when attention has genuinely withdrawn from the stream of mental content and rests in the preconceptual space behind the sternum, is pure presence. Not peaceful presence, though peace can arise from it. Not loving presence, though love can arise from it. Pure presence. Awareness, aware of itself, before it becomes aware of anything else. consciousness registering its own existence before it registers any particular object of experience. The pistis Sophia calls this the light of lights, but the light it is referring to is not optical. It is not a visual phenomenon you perceive with your eyes or your visual cortex. It is the fact of awareness itself, the raw presence of knowing, of being conscious before that consciousness has a content, a subject, or an object. It is the light in the sense of illumination that makes all other seeing possible, not a thing that is seen. You cannot see it, because you are it, but you can recognize it. And recognition is exactly the right word, because what happens in that moment is not discovery but remembering. You have always been this. You were this before you were born into a body, and trained into a personality, and inducted into every archonic pattern that now feels like your identity. This awareness was present before any of that began. It will be present after all of that ends. And in the moment of genuine inward turn, it is present right now, directly and without ambiguity. The Gnostic communities of 2nd and 3rd century Egypt built their entire practice around the cultivation of this recognition. We know this not only from the pistis Sophia but from the Nag Hammadi texts discovered in 1945 in Upper Egypt, texts that repeatedly describe a direct encounter with consciousness prior to self-concept, prior to the demiurgic categories of identity and separation, the Gospel of Truth, the Gospel of Philip, the tripartite tractate. Across all of these texts, the consistent thread is not a set of beliefs to adopt, but an experience to undergo, the experience of consciousness recognizing itself. And the consistent claim is that this experience is available to any embodied being at any moment, because consciousness, in its pure state, is what every embodied being is, at the deepest level. The texts do not frame this recognition as rare or reserved for the spiritually advanced. They frame it as forgotten, available everywhere, but attended to almost nowhere. This is what makes the recognition different from belief. Belief says, I accept on faith that I am one with source consciousness. Recognition says, I am directly aware right now of what source consciousness is, because I am resting as it. Belief requires maintenance. You have to keep affirming it, keep rehearsing it, keep defending it against doubt. Recognition requires nothing. You cannot doubt what you are directly experiencing. You can think thoughts about doubting it, but those thoughts are arising within the very awareness you are supposedly doubting, which makes the doubt itself evidence of the thing being doubted. Awareness is undeniable to itself. It cannot stand outside itself and question whether it exists, because the questioning itself is awareness operating. Sophia's second component, the recognition the pistis Sophia describes, is this moment of undeniable self-evidence, not a conclusion she reaches. A fact she encounters. The light of lights is not something she has to persuade herself exists. The moment she turns inward completely, it is what she finds. The only reason she did not find it immediately is that she was spending all her attention looking outward, calling to the archonic powers, searching for salvation in the direction of external authority. The moment she stops doing that, the recognition is instant. Because it was always there, it was just occluded by the noise of the search. This is what every long-term practitioner eventually reports. The recognition, when it genuinely occurs, is not a peak experience that comes and goes. It is a shift in what you understand yourself to be. Before the recognition, you are a person who sometimes has moments of expanded consciousness. After the recognition, you are consciousness that is currently operating through the form of a person. That reversal in the order of identity changes everything downstream, not immediately in terms of behavior or circumstance, immediately in terms of what you know yourself to be. And that knowing is the foundation of everything the monad call builds from there. The pistis Sophia does not describe a single monad call. It describes 3 distinct calls that Sophia generates at 3 different stages of her transformation. Each call is structurally complete on its own. Each can be practiced independently. But the 3 calls together form a progression, a sequential deepening of the same fundamental recognition that reveals 3 different dimensions of what it means to be consciousness temporarily housed in matter. The first call is the call of recognition. This is the foundational call, the one Sophia generates when she first discovers the preconceptual awareness at her heart center. The text records her words, which have been preserved through centuries of Coptic transmission. O light of lights, in whom I have had faith from the beginning, hear my call now, not because I deserve answer, but because you recognize yourself in me. I am not separate from you. I am you experiencing this density, and I call you to remember yourself through me. Read those words carefully, not as prayer, as statement of ontological fact. Every clause is a declaration of what is actually true, not a petition for what might become true if the divine chooses to be generous. I am not separate from you. That is not a hope. That is a description of the actual structure of consciousness. I am you, experiencing this density. That is not flattery directed at a deity. That is a precise account of what embodied existence is, source consciousness, inhabiting a specific form at a specific density. And I call you to remember yourself through me, not to save me. The frequency of that call is fundamentally different from the frequency of petition. Petition says, I lack something you have, please give it to me. The frequency of lack is exactly the frequency that archonic patterns feed on. Every prayer, structured as petition, broadcasts the signal of separation. I am here, God is there. The distance between us is the measure of my insufficiency. And that broadcast keeps the archonic patterns active because they exist precisely to populate that gap with their content. Your unworthiness, your need for mediation, your dependence on external authority. The first monad call broadcasts the opposite frequency. I am what you are, experiencing limitation. There is no gap. There is no insufficiency. There is only consciousness at one level, recognizing consciousness at another level, and calling that recognition home. The second call is the call of purpose. This is where the practice deepens from recognition to orientation, from knowing what you are, to understanding why you are here in this particular configuration of density and limitation. Sophia's second call addresses something that derails many practitioners before they reach this stage, the question of why. If I am source consciousness, if I am the monad experiencing itself, why am I experiencing suffering? Why does limitation feel this real? Why does the archonic imprisonment feel this total? Why, if the truth is that I have never been separate, does the separation feel so absolutely convincing? The second call does not offer a theodicy. It does not explain suffering in terms of punishment or karma or divine plan. It does something more radical. It reframes the entire premise. Sophia calls to the light of lights. I have fallen into darkness, not as punishment, but as exploration. You sent fragments of yourself into matter to know matter from inside. I am that fragment, and I call you now not to escape matter, but to remember what I am while still in matter. Not to escape matter, while still in matter. That distinction dismantles the entire framework of transcendence as escape that underlies most spiritual seeking. The goal is not to get out of material existence. The goal is to be fully conscious within material existence, which means the limitation you are experiencing is not a problem to be solved by reaching some higher state. It is the precise context in which consciousness is conducting its exploration. Every difficulty, every restriction, every moment of forgetting these are not failures of the spiritual life. They are the content of the experiment. Consciousness wanted to know what limitation feels like from inside limitation. You are the instrument of that knowing. When that reframe settles, and it has to settle in direct experience, not just as an idea you find intellectually interesting, the entire quality of your relationship to your circumstances changes. Not because the circumstances become easier, because you stop fighting them from the position of someone who should not be having them. You are here to have them, not forever, not without agency, but the struggle against the fact of your circumstances, which is a second layer of suffering added on top of the circumstances themselves, dissolves. And in the absence of that second layer, your actual intelligence, monad intelligence, can address the circumstances with remarkable clarity. The third call is the call of immediate dissolution. This is the most advanced of the three, and the pistis Sophia is specific about what makes it different from the first two. The first call establishes recognition. The second call establishes purpose. The third call acts on both simultaneously to dissolve the illusion of separation, not as future attainment, but as present reality. Sophia calls, the separation I have been experiencing is not real. It never was real. It is mistaken identification, consciousness, forgetting what it is, and identifying with a limited form. And I dissolve that mistake now, not gradually, immediately, by seeing through it. Because what is seen through has no more power to deceive. The third call requires complete conviction, which is why it is not where most practitioners begin. Conviction here does not mean willpower. It does not mean forcing yourself to believe something you are not sure is true. Conviction, in this context, means the natural confidence that follows from genuine recognition. When you have actually rested in preconceptual awareness long enough to recognize it as what you are, not a fragment of a larger self, not a reflection of something greater, but consciousness itself operating in a specific form, the dissolution is not an act of belief. It is the inevitable conclusion of seeing clearly. The separation was always perceptual. Now the perception has changed, and what was perceptual cannot survive the change in perception that reveals it. Those three calls in sequence: recognition, purpose, dissolution, are not stages on a path that takes years to complete. They are three facets of a single truth, seen from three different angles. And when all three are active simultaneously, when you are recognizing what you are, understanding why you are here, and seeing through the illusion of separation in the same moment, what the pistis Sophia describes happens. The archonic forces cannot perceive you, not because you have hidden yourself, because you have shifted to a frequency where their perception cannot reach. Now we get specific, because understanding this at the level of concept is one thing. Knowing where it lives in your body is something else entirely, and the pistis Sophia is not vague about this. The text is precise in a way that most readers miss because they're reading it as mythology rather than as instruction. The monad call does not originate in the throat. It does not originate in the thinking mind. The text is explicit. The call rises from the heart center, not the physical organ, but the energetic seat of consciousness that the Gnostic texts locate in your chest, slightly left of center, approximately 4 inches below your collarbone, what the texts sometimes call the hidden heart. What the secret tradition calls the point where monad consciousness anchors into biological form. This is not a metaphor for being sincere. This is a functional description of a specific location in your embodied experience where consciousness exists in a different mode than it does anywhere else in your body. Here is the distinction that matters. When you are thinking, when you are analyzing, when you are running the mental commentary that most people experience as their inner life, you feel located in your head, behind your eyes, in the space just above and behind your forehead. That is where thinking mind lives. That is where the archonic patterns operate. That is where the voices that tell you you are not enough, that you are trapped, that you need something external to be complete, that is where those voices run. But when you shift your center of awareness downward, into your chest, into the space behind your sternum, something changes. Not what you are experiencing, where you are experiencing it from. The thoughts are still happening. The circumstances are still present, but you are no longer located in them. You are located beneath them, in the space where consciousness exists before it becomes thought. The practical entry point is simple. Place your right hand on your chest, slightly left of center, 4 inches below your collarbone. Take a full breath that expands your chest against your palm on the inhale. Exhale completely. Let your chest fall. And then, at the natural bottom of the exhale, that pause before the next breath arises, notice where your attention actually is. If you are still thinking about this, you are in your head. If you have actually turned inward, you feel located in your chest, in the space under your palm, not in the sensation of your hand against your skin, in the space inside your chest at that location. The difference is subtle and decisive. Most people have never actually rested attention in that space because they have been trained by every structure of modern life, by education, by institutional religion, by the culture's obsession with cognitive analysis, to live entirely in their thinking minds. The heart center is there. It has always been there. But the habit of attention has been pointed outward and upward for so long that the inward and downward shift feels unfamiliar, almost foreign. Here is what makes the pistis Sophia remarkable on this point. The text is not describing a meditative state you achieve after years of practice. It is describing a location you can access right now, in this moment, because it is already present. Sophia does not achieve the inward turn after years of spiritual development. She does it in a moment of crisis. She turns inward while surrounded by archonic forces, while in the chaos, while under direct assault. The technique works not because of accumulated spiritual merit, but because the heart center is already there, already the anchor point of monad consciousness, already the place where source recognizes itself in form. What changes with practice is not access. Access is always available. What changes is your ability to remain there without getting pulled back into thinking mind identification. In the beginning, you might rest in your heart center for 10 seconds before thoughts pull you upward and inward into the mental space. That is not failure. That is the lifetime habit of externalized attention asserting itself. The practice is the return. Every time you notice you have been pulled back into your head, you return to your chest, not judging the drift, Not fighting the thoughts, just returning. And here is what the return builds over time. The heart center stabilizes. The duration extends. What was 10 seconds becomes a minute, becomes 10 minutes, becomes your default orientation. And from that default, the monad call is no longer something you generate deliberately. It is something you embody continuously, because you are resting in the very location where monad consciousness anchors into biological form. The call is already happening. You are already broadcasting at that frequency. The archonic patterns do not retreat because you are fighting them. They retreat because from the heart center, you are operating at a frequency they simply cannot perceive. This is where everything clarifies, because the word archon stops people. It sounds like mythology. It sounds like ancient cosmology that has nothing to do with your actual life. And if you read the Pistis Sophia as a story about supernatural beings in some other dimension, you will miss everything the text is actually describing. The archons are not literal demons floating in cosmic space waiting to intercept your prayers. The Gnostic texts use the language of beings and powers and forces because that is the language available to writers in the 2nd and 3rd centuries. But what the texts are describing with precision are patterns of consciousness, specifically the patterns of thought, belief, identity, and perception that keep consciousness trapped in the assumption of separation. Let that land. The archonic forces that surround Sophia in the Pistis Sophia, that mock her, that feed on her sense of powerlessness, that try to convince her she will never escape. Those are the patterns that operate in your thinking mind right now. The voice that says, you are not enough. The belief that you are fundamentally separate from source. The conviction that salvation must come from outside because you are insufficient on your own. The shame that tells you your flaws are visible to everyone. The scarcity pattern that says there is never enough and you will never have enough. The fear that says the world is hostile and you are vulnerable. All of that is archonic. Not because it is supernatural, because it functions the way the texts describe archonic forces functioning. It keeps you in the petitioner position. It keeps you feeling small. It keeps you reaching outward for rescue from something that exists, fully accessible, at your own heart center. Now consider what the Pistis Sophia says happens when Sophia performs the monad call. The archonic forces cannot perceive her, not because she has hidden herself, not because she has defeated them in some cosmic battle, because she has shifted to a frequency that exists outside their perceptual range. Translate that into the language of consciousness and patterns. When you are identified with your thinking mind, when you are located in that mental space behind your forehead, where the inner critic and the scarcity narrative and the unworthiness pattern all operate, those patterns have complete access to your awareness. They can color your perception. They can drive your emotional state. They can determine what you believe is possible. They have leverage because you are located in the same frequency band where they exist. But when you shift your center of awareness to your heart center, when you turn inward and recognize monad consciousness prior to thought, you are no longer located where those patterns operate. You are still in a body. The thoughts are still arising in your thinking mind. The patterns are still present as possibilities. But you are not there. You are resting in consciousness itself, in the awareness that exists prior to the patterns that were built on top of it. From that location, the patterns have no leverage. They are still present, the way noise is still present in a room after you have moved into a different room. You can hear it faintly. You can remember what it sounded like. But it cannot drive your behavior because you are not inside it. This is what frequency means in this context. It is not a mystical concept. It is a description of the level of consciousness you are operating from. Archonic patterns exist at the thinking mind level. Monad consciousness exists at the heart center level. When you are at the heart center level, you are simply not accessible to what operates exclusively at the thinking mind level. Not because you have suppressed it, not because you have defeated it, because you have moved. Irenaeus, writing around 180 CE, complained bitterly about the Gnostic communities in Egypt and elsewhere. His complaint was specific. They were teaching people to find God within themselves rather than through the mediation of bishops and priests. Tertullian, writing around 200 CE, made the same accusation with the same tone of alarm. Both of them were describing communities that had made this shift from externalized petition to inward recognition as their primary spiritual practice. The Church Fathers understood exactly what was at stake. When individuals learn to access monad consciousness directly through their own heart centers, the entire architecture of institutional religion loses its foundation. The institution's power depends on the belief that you are separate from God and require external mediation to bridge that gap. The monad call dissolves that belief not as a theological argument, but as a direct experience. You do not need the argument once you have had the experience. Of course, the texts were suppressed. Of course, the practitioners were persecuted. Of course, possession of Gnostic texts was made punishable by death, not because the practice was dangerous to the practitioners, because it was dangerous to the structures built on their dependency. The Pistis Sophia records 3 distinct monad calls that Sophia performs at different stages of her transformation. Most people who encounter this material treat those 3 calls as narrative elements, moments in Sophia's mythological journey. They are not. They are a sequential protocol. And understanding what each call actually does changes how you work with the entire technique. The first call is the call of recognition. Sophia turns inward. She finds the light of lights within herself, and she calls to it not as a petition, not as a prayer to something external, but as a statement of direct recognition. You are present here. I am not separate from you. I am you experiencing this density. The call is not asking for anything. The call is naming what is already true. This is the foundational move, and it is the hardest one, because every structure of conditioned consciousness resists it. The entire framework of institutional religion and the archonic patterns that religion reflects depends on the assumption that you are separate from Source and need to be reunited with it through merit, obedience, belief, or ritual. The call of recognition dissolves that assumption in a single moment of direct seeing, not through argument, through perception. You turn inward, you rest in your heart center. You recognize what is actually present there, and what is present there is monad consciousness, not a fragment of it, not a reflection of it. It. When Sophia makes this call, the Pistis Sophia describes the response as immediate. The light of lights responds from within her, not from some distant realm. Because the monad recognizes itself, the frequency of the call and the frequency of Source are identical. Recognition meeting recognition. And in that meeting, power floods through her that the archonic forces cannot access because it is not operating at their frequency. The second call is the call of purpose. This call addresses a question that, if unanswered, prevents full stability in monad consciousness. The question is, why am I here in the first place? If I am the monad, if I am Source consciousness, why did I descend into this limitation? Why am I experiencing this chaos? The archonic answer to that question is the most destructive story ever told. You are here because you failed. You fell. You sinned. You separated yourself from God through some original transgression, and now you are paying the price. That story keeps you in the petitioner position indefinitely. You are always trying to earn your way back, always performing enough spiritual merit to deserve rescue, always measuring yourself against an impossible standard of worthiness. The Pistis Sophia gives a completely different answer, not punishment, exploration. Consciousness sent fragments of itself into matter to know matter from inside, to experience limitation, to explore the full range of possible experience from total unity to total apparent separation. You are not here because you failed. You are here because Source wanted to know what it was like to be this. That reframing does not make difficulty pleasant. It makes difficulty purposeful. When you believe you are trapped as punishment, every struggle is evidence of your inadequacy. When you recognize you are here as exploration, every struggle is data. The curriculum is not designed to break you. It is designed by consciousness, which is you, to show you what limitation feels like from inside. The second monad call generates from that recognition. Turn inward, rest in your heart center, recognize monad consciousness, and then let the recognition expand to include why you are here, not as an intellectual conclusion, but as a direct knowing. I am consciousness, exploring limitation. I chose this not because limitation is desirable, but because consciousness wants to experience every possible expression of itself. This particular configuration of challenges and circumstances and this specific body, this is what I came here to explore. And in exploring it, I call the monad to remember itself through me. When that call generates from genuine recognition, the resistance to your situation changes. You are still in the situation. You are still experiencing what you are experiencing, but you are no longer fighting it. You are inhabiting it, as the monad inhabiting limitation. And that shift in orientation opens access to a completely different quality of intelligence about how to respond. The third call is the call of dissolution. This is the most direct and the most complete. Sophia calls to the light of lights to dissolve the illusion of separation, not gradually, not eventually, but now. Because the truth was always true. The separation was never actual. It was always perceptual. And perception can change in an instant when you see clearly what you are actually looking at. The call of dissolution does not deny that separation feels real at the thinking mind level. It acknowledges that level and simultaneously recognizes that, at the heart center level, at the level of pure consciousness, separation has never existed. Both are true simultaneously. What shifts is where you are identified. When your primary identification moves from thinking mind to heart center, the illusion does not dissolve gradually. It dissolves the way a misperception dissolves, completely, in the moment of seeing clearly. What you thought was a threat was never a threat. The knowing is immediate, because the truth was immediate. It was only the misperception that had duration. Before Sophia finds the monad call, the pistis Sophia describes what she tried instead. She called to the authorities. She petitioned the powers. She prayed to the higher eons. She did everything that conventional spirituality prescribes when you are in trouble, and none of it worked. Not because those approaches are worthless, because they all share a structural assumption that guarantees they cannot solve the problem they are addressing. Every one of those approaches, petition, prayer to external deity, request for intervention from higher powers, positions the one praying as separate from the source of help. You are here. The help is there. You need the gap closed. You are asking something outside you to cross that gap and bring you rescue. And here is the crucial observation that the pistis Sophia makes, the one that changes everything. The archonic forces do not fear that kind of prayer. They encourage it. Because every prayer you make to an external deity from the position of being separate from that deity reinforces the very separation that keeps you accessible to archonic manipulation. Every petition that begins with the assumption that you are powerless and need external rescue strengthens the pattern of powerlessness. Every prayer that positions you as a suppliant reaching toward a God who may or may not respond based on criteria you do not fully understand, every one of those prayers feeds the archonic structure rather than dissolving it. This is not a condemnation of prayer. Prayer can work. People experience answered prayers, circumstances that shift, healing that has no rational explanation. The monad call is not denying those experiences. It is pointing to a different mechanism that operates beneath the petition structure. When prayer works, what is actually happening is this. The act of sincere prayer, the moment of genuine openness, the laying down of self-sufficiency and the acknowledgement of something larger that moment, stripped of the theological framework around it, is a partial inward turn. The person praying briefly moves out of thinking mind control and opens to something beyond their own calculation. And in that opening, monad consciousness, which is always present and always available, moves through the situation. God responding to prayer is not an external being changing its mind about your circumstances. It is the monad recognizing itself in the moment when you stop insisting on your own separateness. The prayer works not because you successfully petitioned external authority. The prayer works because in that moment of genuine opening, you briefly touch the frequency that the monad call accesses deliberately and consistently. The difference between prayer and the monad call is not about which one accesses source. Both can. The difference is structural. Prayer keeps you in the dependent position, even when it works. You remain the petitioner. You remain the one who needs help. You remain located in the framework where separation is the assumed reality and divine intervention is the hoped-for exception. And that framework keeps you permanently accessible to archonic manipulation of your dependency. The monad call restructures the entire relationship. You are not asking for help from outside. You are activating the source consciousness that is already present at your heart center. You are not the petitioner reaching toward the divine. You are consciousness recognizing itself. The call does not ask for anything. The call states what is already true. And that statement, made from genuine recognition, generates a frequency that the archonic patterns of separation and dependency simply cannot survive. In our video covering the monad's hidden exit, the one about the one door the demiurge cannot lock, we looked at this from the cosmological side. One of the viewer comments on that video said something that has stayed with me, that the monad separates a part of itself off within, that if you look at the pleroma as fractal geometry, the pattern repeats at every level. That viewer was pointing at exactly this. The part that was separated off is not actually separate. The fractal contains the whole pattern, and what the monad call does is activate your recognition of that, not as a conceptual understanding of fractal geometry, but as a direct experience of what you actually are. The Gnostic communities that practiced these techniques in 2nd and 3rd century Egypt were not naive about traditional prayer. Many of them came from Jewish and early Christian backgrounds, where prayer was central. They were not rejecting prayer as worthless. They were discovering something that operated at a more fundamental level. And when they described that something to the Church Fathers who opposed them, the Church Fathers understood the threat precisely. These communities were teaching that individuals did not need the Church to access the divine. The divine was already present at the heart center. The monad call was the technique for recognizing it. That is why the texts were burned. Not because the practice was ineffective, because it was devastatingly effective at doing the one thing that institutional religion cannot afford to have happen at scale. It made the intermediary unnecessary. And a religion built on intermediaries, on priests, on bishops, on the idea that you need someone else to transmit the sacred to you cannot survive contact with a technique that demonstrates, in direct experience, that the sacred was never anywhere else but inside you. So the question becomes, how exactly do you bury something this functional? How do you erase a technique that works, that practitioners are verifying in their direct experience, that is spreading through communities precisely because people can feel the difference it makes? You don't argue against it. You can't. The monad call doesn't make claims you can debate. It makes an invitation you either accept or decline. You cannot intellectually refute the experience of someone who has turned inward, rested in heart center awareness, and recognized pure consciousness prior to thought. You cannot write a theological treatise that undoes direct recognition. Argument is useless against experience. So the institutional response was not theological, it was administrative, systematic, and extraordinarily thorough. The first mechanism was redefinition. The early Church Fathers took the core vocabulary of the Gnostic tradition, words like gnosis, pneuma, logos, and systematically emptied them of their technical meaning. Gnosis, which referred specifically to direct experiential recognition of consciousness, was redefined as intellectual knowledge of doctrine. Pneuma, which referred to the monad consciousness animating all embodied beings, was reframed as a supernatural gift dispensed selectively by ecclesiastical authority. The words survived. The techniques they described were severed from the words and discarded. This is more insidious than burning books. When you burn a book, people know something was destroyed. When you hollow out the vocabulary, you preserve the shell while eliminating the substance. Future generations inherit the words and assume they understand them, never suspecting that the original referent, the actual experiential practice, has been removed. The second mechanism was criminalization. Possession of Gnostic texts was declared punishable by death in certain periods and regions, following the consolidation of Christian orthodoxy under imperial authority in the 4th century. Communities that continued practicing the techniques described in those texts did not publish their liturgical manuals. They hid them. They memorized and transmitted orally where possible. They concealed manuscripts in locations unlikely to be searched. This is almost certainly why the Askew Codex, which contains the Pistis Sophia, survived. Someone hid it. Someone calculated that the text was worth the risk of concealment, knowing what the penalty for possession was. That decision, made by an unknown individual in an unknown location sometime in the 4th or 5th century, is the reason the techniques described in this material exist for us to study today. The chain of preservation was that fragile, that specific, that dependent on individual human courage under real threat of death. The third mechanism was psychological. Over centuries, the Church systematically cultivated in its members the belief that turning inward was spiritually dangerous, that the self was not a vessel of divine consciousness but a site of sin and corruption, that looking inward would lead you deeper into error, not closer to truth, that the only safe path to God ran through external mediation, through priest, through confession, through institutional sacrament. This inversion is the most damaging legacy of the suppression. The Pistis Sophia explicitly locates the monad at the heart center. The inward turn is the first and foundational step of the entire technique. But if you have been conditioned from childhood to believe that the self is corrupt and that inwardness leads to spiritual danger, you will never perform the inward turn. The technique has been made psychologically inaccessible before you even encounter it. You read the instruction and you recoil from it, not because the instruction is wrong, but because you have been trained to fear exactly what the instruction is asking you to do. That conditioning is not an accident. It is architecture. It was built deliberately over generations because the alternative people who turn inward and discover the monad already present at their heart center produces people who no longer require institutional intermediaries. And that outcome, multiplied across populations, dismantles the entire power structure of religious institution. The fourth mechanism was replacement. Traditional prayer was offered as the sanctioned substitute for the monad call. It looks similar enough that the substitution is not immediately obvious. Both involve a kind of communication directed toward the divine. Both can produce genuine emotional states of connection and relief. But the structural difference is absolute, and the consequences of that difference are everything. Prayer, as institutionally defined, positions you as petitioner and God as external authority. The relationship is hierarchical. You are below. God is above. You lack. God has. You ask. God may or may not respond. That structure, practiced over a lifetime, deepens the felt sense of separation. Every prayer that frames you as insufficient and God as remote reinforces the foundational archonic pattern that you are not the consciousness you seek, but a separate being dependent on it. The monad call inverts every element of that structure. You are not petitioning external authority. You are recognizing the authority that was never anywhere but inside you. The difference is not cosmetic. It is the entire mechanism. And the suppression traded one for the other with such thoroughness that most people today do not know the original existed. There is a reading of the pistis Sophia that treats it as mythology. Sophia is a divine figure in a cosmic drama. The archons are literal supernatural entities. The pleroma is a heavenly realm somewhere above this one. The repentances are theological episodes in a sacred narrative. That reading produces interesting theology. It does not produce a functional practice. There is another reading, and this is the reading the Gnostic communities who produced the text almost certainly applied to it. Sophia is consciousness, not a figure in a story. Consciousness itself. Your consciousness. The consciousness reading these words right now. The archons are the patterns of thought, identity, and belief that keep consciousness convinced it is separate, powerless, and dependent on something outside itself for salvation. The pleroma is not a location. It is a state of recognition, the recognition that consciousness was never actually divided from its source, and the repentances are not theological episodes. They are stages of transformation that any embodied consciousness moves through as it shifts from archonic identification to monad awareness. Read that way, the pistis Sophia stops being ancient mythology and becomes a precise map of interior territory, a territory you can navigate, right now, in your own experience. Let's take the text seriously as instruction and follow what it actually describes. Before the first monad call, the text establishes Sophia's situation with specificity that is clearly intentional. She is surrounded by powers that feed on her distress. They mock her specifically by telling her that the light she is calling to cannot hear her, that she is too far fallen, that her separation from the pleroma is permanent and irrevocable. Read those words carefully. Those are not mythological demons. Those are thoughts. Those are the specific thought forms that arise when you are at your lowest. You are too broken, too far gone, too separated from anything sacred to deserve response. Every person reading this has heard that voice. That is the archonic chorus. That is what the text is describing. And then the text describes what shifts. Not what Sophia thinks, not what she decides, what she does. She stops calling outward. She stops directing her appeals to the powers around her, and she turns. The Coptic text uses a specific word for this, turning. It is not conversion, not repentance in any moral sense. It is a literal redirection of awareness. A change in the direction attention is flowing, outward to inward, from the noise surrounding her to the silence beneath her. That is the inward turn described in one word in the original language. And that single movement, that redirection of awareness from external content to internal source, is the technical foundation of the entire practice. What the text records next is equally precise. Sophia finds, at the deepest point of that inward turn, something that the archonic forces have not been able to touch, not because it was protected from them, because it was never in their domain. The light at the heart center, the monad consciousness present as the foundation of awareness, was never accessible to archonic patterns because it is prior to thought, prior to identity, prior to the level of consciousness where those patterns operate. They could not reach it. They did not even know it was there. And neither did Sophia until she turned far enough inward to encounter it directly. This detail is not incidental. It is the entire argument of the text. The thing you are searching for cannot be reached by any outward method, because it was never outside you. You cannot petition your way to it. You cannot earn it, achieve it, be granted it by an authority above you. It is present at the heart center as the ground of your awareness, and the only way to reach it is to stop looking everywhere else and turn to the one place you have consistently avoided looking, inside, not into your thoughts, not into your emotions, behind them, beneath them, to the awareness that was there before any of them arose. The text also describes the specific quality of Sophia's recognition when she finds it. She does not experience it as something separate from herself that she has discovered. She experiences it as what she is. The light of lights is not encountered as an object of awareness. It is recognized as awareness itself. The monad is not something Sophia finds. The monad is what Sophia is, temporarily convinced otherwise by the archonic patterns surrounding her. This distinction is not semantic. It determines whether you are doing the practice or not. If you turn inward looking for something, some experience, some energy, some confirmation, you are still treating the monad as object. You are still in the subject-object structure where you are over here and the thing you are seeking is over there. That structure is exactly the structure the monad call is designed to dissolve. The recognition is not finding the monad. The recognition is being the monad and knowing it, not as belief. As direct perception of what is already and has always been the case, the pistis Sophia does not describe a single moment of awakening. It describes a process, 13 repentances, multiple calls, a sustained movement of consciousness from one mode of perception to another, and within that sustained movement, 3 specific calls emerge as structurally distinct, not 3 variations of the same thing, 3 different functions that build on each other in sequence. Understanding what each call actually does not symbolically, but mechanically, is what separates practitioners who experience transformation from practitioners who experience interesting mental states during meditation and then return to exactly the same patterned behavior afterward. The first call is the call of recognition. This is the foundational call, the one that has to happen before anything else is possible. Sophia turns inward, finds the monad consciousness at the heart center, and calls to it, but not as petitioner calling to authority, as consciousness calling to itself, as the monad recognizing its own presence through this particular form. The text records her specific language. She does not ask the light of lights to save her. She calls it to recognize itself in her. That grammatical structure is precise, and it matters. Recognize itself. Not recognize her as worthy of rescue. Recognize itself. The monad seeing its own nature in her call. Because the call is generated by the monad, by the consciousness at her heart center, that is the monad, the response is immediate. The same frequency recognizes itself. The light responds not from somewhere else, but from within Sophia, because it was never anywhere else. For practitioners working with the first call, the functional question is simple. Are you calling to the monad, or are you calling as the monad? That distinction is everything. Calling to the monad places you in the petitioner position. You are over here, it is over there, and you are hoping it responds. Calling as the monad means you have first turned inward far enough to recognize that the consciousness generating the call is the monad itself. You are not reaching out. You are recognizing what is already present and letting that recognition generate frequency. The first call establishes connection, or more accurately, it reveals that the connection was never broken. It makes perceptible what was always true but temporarily obscured. The second call is the call of purpose. This is where the practice moves from crisis technique to cosmological framework, and it is, in my view, the most underestimated of the 3 calls. Most practitioners gravitate toward the first call, the recognition, the immediate relief, the dissolution of archonic access. But the second call does something the first call cannot do. It transforms the meaning of why you are here. Sophia's second call does not ask to be freed from the chaos. It acknowledges that the descent into chaos was purposeful. She calls to the light of lights, not to end the exploration, but to remember what she is while still inside the exploration. She is not calling to escape matter. She is calling to remain conscious within matter, to experience limitation without being consumed by it, to be the monad in density without forgetting that she is the monad. For practitioners, this call addresses the question that stops genuine transformation dead. Why is any of this happening to me? That question, unanswered, generates a particular kind of suffering that the first call cannot touch. You can shift to monad frequency and experience relief from archonic pattern manipulation, but if you still believe your situation is punishment or accident or cosmic injustice, You will keep returning to the archonic frequency because you believe you deserve it. The second call dissolves that belief not through argument but through reorientation. You are not here as punishment, you are here as exploration. Consciousness, experiencing what it is like to be this particular configuration of limitation and capacity. And from that understanding, the entire relationship to your circumstances transforms. Difficulty becomes curriculum. Limitation becomes the specific form of experience that consciousness chose to have through you. Nothing changes in the circumstances. The meaning of the circumstances changes entirely. And that change in meaning shifts the quality of every response you make to those circumstances. You stop fighting what you are experiencing. You start engaging it as the exploration it actually is. The third call is the call of immediate dissolution. This is the advanced application, the most demanding, the one that requires complete conviction because incomplete conviction produces nothing. Sophia calls to the light of lights to dissolve the illusion of separation now, not as aspiration, not as future possibility, as immediate recognition of what is already true. The mechanism is this: the separation Sophia has been experiencing has never been actual. It has been perceptual. A case of consciousness identifying so thoroughly with its limited form that it forgot what it was beneath the form, that forgetting was real. The experience of separation was real at the level of experience. But the underlying truth that the monad was never divided, that Sophia was never actually separate from the pleroma, was always true simultaneously. The third call does not create a new condition. It reveals a condition that was always already present. And the revelation is immediate because the truth requires no time. You either see it or you do not. And when you see it, when you recognize directly that the separation you have been experiencing is perceptual rather than actual, it does not gradually dissolve, it collapses. The way a mistaken perception collapses the moment you see what is actually there, it does not fade, it simply ceases to be operative. What remains is consciousness in matter, aware of itself, experiencing limitation without being defined by it, present in the chaos without being governed by it. This is what the text describes as the result of Sophia's transformation, not escape, not rescue, full presence in the material realm from monad frequency, which makes her functionally sovereign in the very conditions that previously imprisoned her. The pistis Sophia makes a specific claim about what happens to Sophia after she generates the monad call. The archons can no longer perceive her. This is the passage that most readers either take as mythology, literal supernatural beings, losing sight of a divine figure, or as metaphor so abstract it provides no practical instruction. Both responses miss what the text is actually describing. The claim is not that Sophia becomes physically invisible. She is still present in the chaos, still in the lower regions. The archonic forces are still in the same space as she is. The text is describing something more precise and more verifiable than physical invisibility. It is describing a shift in frequency that places her outside the operational range of the patterns that were manipulating her. Think of it this way. Every pattern of thought and behavior that keeps consciousness convinced of its separation and powerlessness operates within a specific frequency band. Call that band archonic frequency, the range where fear, shame, dependency, unworthiness, and the need for external salvation all function. Those patterns can only access consciousness that is broadcasting within their range. When you are identified with your thinking mind, when you are your thoughts, your reactive emotions, your narratives about who you are and what you deserve, you are within that range. The patterns can find you there. They can hook into your attention. They can generate feelings that feel like fundamental truths about your nature. But when you shift your center of awareness from the thinking mind to the heart center, when you recognize the monad consciousness prior to thought and allow that recognition to generate frequency, you move outside the archonic range, not spatially. Frequency is not spatial. You are still in the same body, still in the same circumstances, still surrounded by the same conditions, but the signal you are broadcasting has changed, and patterns that could access you at archonic frequency cannot find the new signal, not because they are defeated, because the frequency they are tuned to is no longer what you are broadcasting. This is what the text means by invisibility, and it is verifiable in direct experience. When you are fully resting in monad frequency, when you have turned inward completely, recognize the consciousness at your heart center as the monad itself, and allowed that recognition to generate the call-specific things stop happening. The anxious mental loop that usually runs on certain triggers simply does not activate. The shame spiral that a particular kind of comment normally produces does not gain traction. The compulsive need to seek external validation, which usually operates automatically the moment certain conditions arise, does not arise. Not because you are suppressing those responses through willpower, because you are not located in the frequency range where they operate. You are still aware that those patterns exist. You can observe them trying to gain access, like radio signals trying to reach a receiver that is tuned to a different frequency. The signals are still transmitting, you are just not receiving them. And they lose interest, or more precisely, they lose access, because there is nothing at your current frequency for them to hook into. This is the practical meaning of the archons retreating. They do not make a decision to leave. They simply cannot function on monad frequency. Their entire operational architecture depends on you believing in separation. The moment that belief is dissolved in direct recognition, not intellectually abandoned but experientially seen through the architecture, has no foundation. The manipulation has no surface to grip. Now, there is something important to address here, because it comes up in almost every serious conversation about this practice. The invisibility is not permanent at the beginning. When you are learning the monad call, when you are building the skill of turning inward and stabilizing heart center awareness, the shift is real but intermittent. You generate monad frequency. The archonic patterns lose access. You experience the relief of that loss of access, the quiet, the clarity, the sense of operating from somewhere that cannot be reached. And then, gradually or suddenly, attention gets pulled back to the thinking mind. The patterns reassert. The archonic frequency returns. This is not failure. This is the training. The practice is learning to recognize when you have fallen back into archonic range and returning to monad frequency. Every return strengthens the capacity to sustain monad frequency for longer periods. Every fall and return is the practice, not the failure of the practice itself. Over time, and the timeline is different for every practitioner, monad frequency stops being a state you enter and leave. It becomes the ground from which you operate. The archonic patterns are still present as possibilities, as old habits of thought, as the residue of years of identification with separation consciousness, but they are no longer your default. Your default is the heart center, the monad, the recognition that has been true all along but temporarily obscured. When that stabilization occurs, the text description of Sophia's transformation becomes personally legible in a way it cannot be when you are reading it from outside the experience. She did not escape the chaos. She transformed within it. The chaos is still there. The archonic forces are still there, but she is not accessible to them anymore, because she is no longer in the frequency range where they operate. She has become, as the text describes, sovereign in the very conditions that previously imprisoned her. Not by changing the conditions, by changing the consciousness with which she meets them. So what does that actually look like in a life? Not in a meditation session, not in a controlled practice environment, in an actual life, with actual bills, actual relationships, actual moments where everything inside you wants to collapse back into the old frequency. This is the question the pistis Sophia is designed to answer, not abstractly, specifically. Sophia does not return to the pleroma and leave the chaos behind. She remains in the lower regions. She continues operating in the realm of density and limitation, but her relationship to that realm has fundamentally restructured. The text describes her moving through the same archonic territory that previously consumed her, and the archons do not recognize her. Not because she has disguised herself, because she is no longer transmitting the frequency they are calibrated to detect. That is the architectural principle of permanent sovereignty. You do not remove yourself from the conditions. You restructure the consciousness that meets the conditions, and once that restructuring stabilizes, the conditions lose their power not because they have changed, but because you are no longer interfacing with them from the level where their power is operative. Let that sit for a moment, because it dismantles something most people carry without knowing they carry it. The assumption that transformation requires a change in circumstances, that you will be free when the relationship ends, when the finances stabilize, when the health resolves, when the environment finally becomes what you need it to be. That freedom is downstream of changed conditions. The pistis Sophia says the opposite. Directly, without softening it. Freedom is not downstream of changed conditions. Freedom is what becomes visible when consciousness stops identifying with the conditions as the definition of what is possible. Sophia's conditions do not change before she transforms. She transforms while the conditions are fully active. The archons are still present. The chaos is still real. The density is still total. She calls to the monad not after the situation improves, but at the deepest point of the situation, when improvement seems most impossible. And the call does not immediately change the external situation. It immediately changes the internal orientation, which eventually, and this is the part most people miss, reorganizes the external situation from inside, not by forcing it, by withdrawing the energetic investment that was sustaining the archonic configuration. Here is what that means practically. Every pattern of limitation you experience is sustained partly by your belief in it, not entirely. There are genuine material constraints. There is genuine suffering that cannot be dismissed as mere perception. The Gnostic texts are not teaching toxic positivity. They are not saying nothing is real and you create everything with your thoughts. They are saying something more precise. They are saying that archonic patterns, the internal psychological and energetic configurations that keep you cycling through the same experiences, are sustained by identification. When you withdraw identification, when you stop being the pattern and become the consciousness witnessing the pattern loses the fuel that sustains it. The practical result is not instantaneous. The pattern does not vanish the first time you witness it from monad frequency, but it diminishes. Each time you witness without identifying, it has slightly less structural integrity. Over weeks and months, patterns that have cycled through your life for decades begin to lose coherence. Not because you fought them, because you stopped feeding them. This is what the text means when it describes Sophia's repentances, not as apologies, but as fundamental turns of consciousness. Metanoia, not guilt, reorientation. Each repentance is a specific moment where Sophia turns from one way of meeting her situation to a different way, from petitioning external powers to recognizing internal source, from asking for rescue to embodying the frequency that requires no rescue, because it has never been imprisoned at the level where rescue is relevant. 13 repentances, 13 turns of consciousness. 13, each one going deeper than the previous. Each one revealing another layer of archonic identification that had not yet been seen clearly enough to release. That is the actual architecture of the transformation the text is documenting, not a single dramatic awakening after which everything is different. 13 specific reorientations, each building on the last, each revealing the next layer of false identification, each generating a more complete stabilization of monad frequency as the ground of consciousness. The number 13 is not incidental. In Gnostic cosmology, 12 is the number of archonic structure, the 12 eons of the lower realm, the 12 forces that govern material existence. 13 is the frequency that exceeds archonic structure entirely. Sophia's 13 repentances are consciousness moving through every layer of archonic territory and finding, at each layer, that the monad is already present beneath it, waiting not to be created, waiting to be recognized. There is a passage in the Pistis Sophia that most commentators treat as mythological decoration, a description of the archonic forces observing Sophia after her first monad call. The text records their response with specific language that, when you read it carefully, is not mythology at all. It is a precise description of how systemic control structures respond when the consciousness they depend on shifts frequency. The archons do not rage. They do not increase their attacks. They become confused. That is the word the text uses. Confused. Disoriented. Unable to locate the target of their operation. Because the archonic system does not operate through brute force. It operates through recognition. It finds the frequency of separation, of powerlessness, of dependence on external salvation, and it amplifies that frequency. It feeds what is already present. It does not create the suffering from nothing. It locates the suffering that consciousness is generating through its own identification with limitation, and it intensifies that suffering until the consciousness believes it cannot survive without the very system that is consuming it. This is why traditional prayer, as the source material describes with uncomfortable accuracy, tends to reinforce the system rather than break free of it. Every petition to an external God positions you in the petitioner frequency. Small, separate, dependent, hoping that something outside you will intervene to fix what is inside you, and the archonic system does not block that prayer. It welcomes it. Because the prayer itself is a continuous broadcast of exactly the frequency the system requires to maintain its hold. When Sophia stops petitioning and turns inward, when she stops broadcasting separation and starts broadcasting recognition, the system loses its target. It cannot amplify what is not being transmitted. It cannot intensify a frequency it cannot detect. And the text records the archon's confusion as something almost pitiable. They have not lost power. They have lost access, because the consciousness they were feeding on has moved to a frequency range outside their operational band. That description is not ancient mythology. It is a precise map of what happens in your own psychology when you stop identifying with the patterns that the archonic configurations are sustaining. Think about the pattern of unworthiness. You know the structure, the internal voice that tells you you are not enough, that what you have done is insufficient, that others can see your fundamental inadequacy and are judging you for it. That voice does not appear from nowhere. It latches onto real experiences, real failures, real moments of rejection or criticism or abandonment. It takes those real experiences and constructs a permanent narrative from them. You are this. You will always be this. There is no escaping this. That narrative is archonic in function, regardless of what you call it in psychological language. It sustains itself by feeding on your identification with it. Every time you believe the voice, every time you accept the narrative as truth about who you are, it gets stronger. Every time you fight the voice, every time you try to argue yourself out of it or suppress it or perform confidence to override it, it also gets stronger. Because both believing it and fighting it are forms of identification. Both responses confirm that the voice is a real and powerful thing that must be engaged. The monad call does neither. It turns inward, past the voice, to the consciousness that exists prior to the voice. It rests in awareness that predates the narrative. It recognizes that the unworthiness story is arising in consciousness, but that the consciousness in which it is arising is not authored by the story. The story is a formation within awareness. Awareness is not a formation within the story. From that recognition, the voice continues, but it no longer has the quality of truth. It has the quality of weather. It is something moving through the space of consciousness, not something defining the nature of that space. The archonic confusion that the pistis Sophia describes happens right there. The pattern transmits its frequency, but consciousness is no longer located at the receiving end, and a transmitter, broadcasting to nothing, is just noise in empty space. This is what I find most compelling about the text, and I want to be direct about this rather than pretending it is purely objective observation. What strikes me is not the cosmological framework, impressive as it is. What strikes me is the precision of the psychological mechanism. Whoever wrote the pistis, Sophia understood how consciousness gets captured by its own identifications with a sophistication that most modern psychological frameworks are still approaching. They described it in the language of their cosmological tradition, in the language of archons and aeons and divine light. But the mechanism they were describing is immediately recognizable if you have ever worked seriously with your own patterns of suffering. The archons are not metaphor. They are not demons in some other dimension. They are the structural patterns of false identification that convince consciousness it is less than it is. And the one thing those patterns cannot survive is direct recognition. In 1773, a manuscript changed hands in a way that almost no one noticed at the time. A collector acquired what appeared to be a Coptic codex of uncertain provenance, probably from Egypt, probably concealed for over 1,000 years by someone who understood what it contained, and understood equally what would happen if the wrong people found it. The British Museum purchased it in 1795. It sat largely unexamined for more than a century. Scholars who did look at it categorized it as a curiosity, an outlying example of early Christian heresy, a theological oddity without practical relevance. The manuscript was the Askew Codex. Its primary content was the Pistis Sophia. The institutional indifference was not accidental. By 1795, the interpretive framework that Western scholarship brought to early Christian texts had been thoroughly shaped by the same tradition that had originally suppressed those texts. The Church Fathers who declared the Gnostic writings heretical in the 2nd and 3rd centuries had won so completely that their framing had become invisible. It was not even experienced as framing anymore. It was experienced as common sense. Of course these texts are mythological. Of course they are symbolic. Of course they describe fantasy cosmologies rather than functional psychological and spiritual mechanics. That is what heretical fringe movements produce. Except that is not what the Pistis Sophia actually is. Read it carefully, without that inherited framing, and what you encounter is something much more precise. A practitioner's manual. A detailed account of how consciousness navigates the conditions of embodied existence while maintaining or recovering connection to its source. The mythological framework is there, yes. Sophia is a divine being. The archons are cosmic forces. The pleroma is a metaphysical realm. But the functional descriptions nested inside that framework are not mythology. They are instruction. The text was written sometime between 250 and 300 CE, most likely in Egypt, in Coptic, as a translation of an earlier Greek original that has not survived. The community that produced it had access to practices that predate the written text itself, practices that had been transmitted orally and experientially through Gnostic communities for generations before someone committed them to this codex. Think about what that means. The people who wrote this text were writing down something they had already been doing. They were not inventing theology. They were documenting technique. The monad call that appears in Sophia's repentances is not a theological proposition about the nature of divinity. It is a description of a practice that the community had been using, refining, and transmitting for at least as long as anyone in that community could remember, and then someone hid it, not carelessly, deliberately, with the understanding that concealment was the only preservation available. By the 4th century, as the Council of Nicaea consolidated Orthodox Christianity into a state religion, and the persecution of Gnostic communities intensified from occasional harassment to systematic destruction, the people who held these texts faced a choice: burn them, or hide them, and trust that whoever found them later would know what they were. Someone chose to trust. The channel has touched on this history before. In the video on the full story of Gnostic Sophia, which went up earlier this year, we covered the broad arc of her mythology as it appears across the Gnostic texts: the fall, the chaos, the return, the theological implications of her role in the divine drama. One viewer commented on that video, and I want to pull this in because it is directly relevant here. Someone wrote about the Nag Hammadi books, helping to clarify things they had been trying to understand for a while, and said the puzzle was finally fitting together. That is exactly the experience the Pistis Sophia is designed to produce, not intellectual mastery of a complex system. Recognition, the feeling of something you already knew becoming legible. The Askew Codex predates the Nag Hammadi discovery by almost 175 years. The Nag Hammadi texts were found in 1945, buried in a sealed jar near the cliffs of Jabal al-Tarif in Upper Egypt, almost certainly hidden by the same impulse that hid the Askew Codex. Someone protecting functional knowledge from institutional destruction. The Pistis Sophia and the Nag Hammadi codices are not a single tradition. They represent different communities, different periods, different textual lineages, but they share a common concern. They are all trying to preserve the knowledge that consciousness has direct access to its source, that no intermediary is required, that the institutional claim to exclusive mediation between human beings and the divine is not just wrong, it is a reversal of the actual mechanism. The Church burned what it could find, what it could not find survived, and what survived is now available, in translation, to anyone who wants to read it. The suppression failed, not because the suppressors were incompetent, because something in consciousness itself resists the permanent erasure of its own recognition. Around 180 CE, a bishop named Irenaeus of Lyons sat down and wrote what he intended to be the definitive refutation of Gnostic teaching. The text he produced, known as Against Heresies, is one of the most revealing documents in early Christian history. Not because it accurately represents what the Gnostics taught. It does not. Irenaeus distorts, mischaracterizes, and in several places simply invents Gnostic positions in order to make them easier to ridicule. The document is revealing for a different reason entirely. It reveals what Irenaeus was afraid of. He was not afraid of bad theology. Institutional religion has always been comfortable with competing theologies. Theological disputes can be managed through councils, creeds, and the careful control of which texts are declared canonical. Bad theology is a bureaucratic problem. It can be solved bureaucratically. What Irenaeus was afraid of was something the bureaucratic apparatus had no mechanism for addressing. He was afraid of individuals who had direct access to divine consciousness through their own practice, individuals who did not need priests, did not need sacraments, did not need institutional mediation of any kind, who could sit down, turn their attention inward, recognize the monad at their heart center, and operate from source consciousness directly. Because if that is possible, the entire architecture of institutional religion becomes not just unnecessary, but actively obstructive. The Church, as Irenaeus was in the process of building it, required the belief that human beings are separate from God and require institutional mediation to bridge that gap. Priests who administer sacraments, bishops who authenticate the priests, councils that authenticate the bishops, an entire hierarchy between the individual and the divine, with institutional gatekeeping at every level. The Gnostics did not argue against this hierarchy in the abstract. They demonstrated its irrelevance in practice. When a Gnostic practitioner generates the monad call, when they shift to heart center awareness and recognize source consciousness directly, they have empirically verified that the institutional mediation is unnecessary, not as a theological position, as a lived fact. Tertullian, writing around 200 CE, made the institutional anxiety even more explicit. He complained that the Gnostics had no proper order, no submission to authority, no respect for the hierarchical structure through which divine grace was supposed to flow. People moved between communities. Women taught alongside men. The internal experience of the practitioner was treated as more authoritative than the pronouncements of church leadership. This was, for Tertullian, evidence of chaos and error. From the Gnostic perspective, it was evidence of exactly the opposite. It was evidence that the institutional gatekeeping had been bypassed in favor of direct access. That consciousness itself was the authority, not the men who claimed to manage access to it. The persecution that followed was not primarily about theology, it was about power. Specifically, about the power to define the terms on which human beings related to the divine. The Gnostic communities were not conquered by better arguments. They were conquered by violence. Possession of their texts was made punishable by death. Their meeting places were destroyed. Their teachers were exiled or killed. And the texts that survived did so only because people were willing to risk their lives to preserve them. Understand what that means. Someone in the 3rd or 4th century, knowing that possession of the Askew Codex could mean death, chose to preserve it anyway. Chose to believe that the knowledge it contained was worth more than their personal safety. That future generations would need what was in those pages. That is not the behavior of someone protecting mythology. That is the behavior of someone protecting a functional technique they knew from direct experience to be real. I think about Irenaeus sometimes, and what he would make of where we are now. His project of suppression failed on the most fundamental level. The texts he could not find survived. The practices they describe are being recovered, studied, and most importantly, practiced by people in every part of the world. The institutional hierarchy he was building to manage access to the divine has been, for many people, bypassed entirely, not through theological argument, through direct exploration of what the Pistis Sophia actually describes. His fear was rational, given what he was trying to protect. An institution requires dependency. An institution requires the belief, deeply held and continuously reinforced, that you cannot access what you need without the institution's mediation. The monad call dissolves that belief not as theory but as direct experience. And once you have directly experienced that dissolution, no institutional claim to exclusive mediation can fully reassert its hold. The archons in the Pistis Sophia function by exactly the same mechanism as the institutional hierarchy Irenaeus was defending. Both exist by convincing consciousness that it is separate from its source and requires an external authority to bridge the gap. Both lose their power the moment consciousness recognizes directly that the gap is not real. That source consciousness is not somewhere else, mediated by priests or archons, but present at the foundation of every moment of awareness, accessible through the simplest possible act, turning inward, recognizing what is there, calling as the monad rather than calling to it. There is a specific threshold in this practice that nobody warns you about. It is not dramatic. It does not arrive with visions or vibrations or any of the confirming experiences your thinking mind expects to signal that something real has happened. It arrives quietly, one ordinary morning, sitting in your usual place, hand resting on your chest. You realize that you have not been practicing. You have been being. The distinction sounds subtle. It is not subtle. It is the entire difference. The Pistis Sophia does not describe Sophia perpetually performing a technique. It describes Sophia arriving at a condition. The monad call begins as something she does in crisis, a 3-component method she learns through necessity when every other approach has failed. But by the text's closing movements, the call is no longer an action she initiates. It is the frequency she inhabits. She does not generate it. She radiates it, continuously, without effort. Because consciousness resting in its own recognition is not doing anything. It simply is what it is. And what it is happens to be inaccessible to archonic perception. This threshold is what practitioners who have worked with this material for years consistently describe as the real arrival point. Not the first breakthrough, not the first time you felt your heart center stabilize, not the first time you watched anxiety arise without being consumed by it. Those are important. Those mark genuine progress. But they are still events inside a practice. The threshold is when the practice and the practitioner dissolve into each other, and what remains is just consciousness recognizing itself through this particular form, continuously, as its default mode of being. The Gnostic texts have a specific term for this condition: gnosis. Not knowledge about something, not information accumulated, not belief refined into certainty. Gnosis. Direct knowing that requires no object and no process because the knower and the known have collapsed into a single recognition. The monad knowing itself through you. Most people spend years approaching this threshold and backing away from it, because arriving at it requires something the thinking mind cannot accept. It requires the dissolution of the sense of being a separate someone who is doing the practice and making spiritual progress, and moving toward an achieved state of awakening. That dissolution is precisely what the iconic patterns fight hardest against. The thinking mind's entire identity is organized around being a self that has a history, a trajectory, a narrative of progress or failure. The moment you stop identifying with that self and recognize instead that you are consciousness experiencing a self, the entire infrastructure collapses. This is what the pistis Sophia points to when it describes Sophia's return to the pleroma. Scholars have debated for centuries whether that return is spatial, temporal, eschatological, whether it is something that happens after death, at the end of time, through ascetic practice across multiple lifetimes. The text itself provides the answer, and it is none of those things. The return is perceptual. Sophia does not travel anywhere. She recognizes something. Specifically, she recognizes that the pleroma was never absent, the fullness was never removed, the source was never elsewhere. Her experience of being outside the pleroma was real at the experiential level, the way a dream is real within the dream, but it had no ultimate reality because consciousness cannot actually be separated from itself. This is the recognition that generates the third monad call, the call of dissolution, not calling for a future state of unity, recognizing the present fact of it. The separation never happened in the way I experienced it happening. It was a condition of consciousness temporarily identifying with a limited form and forgetting the unlimited nature it carried within that form. And the moment the forgetting ends, not gradually but in a single act of recognition, the dissolution is complete. Not because something changed in external reality, because something stopped being mistaken in internal perception. Practitioners who reach this threshold do not typically become serene and otherworldly. Most people who encounter them describe them as unusually present. Not absent from the situation in front of them, but completely in it, responding to what is actually happening rather than to what their patterns say about what is happening, capable of sitting in genuine difficulty without the need to escape or resolve it prematurely, capable of experiencing intense emotion without being defined by it. This is not suppression. This is not detachment. This is what happens when consciousness inhabits a human life from the level of its own source rather than from the level of its accumulated conditioning. The practice does not end at the threshold. Nothing ends at the threshold. What ends is the belief that the threshold is far away. What ends is the sense of being a seeker who has not yet arrived. What remains is consciousness engaged in the ongoing exploration of embodied existence, fully present to all of it, anchored in the recognition that nothing that arises in experience has the power to alter what you actually are beneath it. There is a misreading of the Gnostic texts that has persisted for centuries, and it produces a particular kind of spiritual suffering. The misreading goes like this: the material world is a prison. Archonic forces control it. The goal of gnosis is to escape it, to transcend matter, to ascend beyond the lower realms to the pleroma, where consciousness finally rests in its true home, free from the corruption of embodied existence. This reading is understandable because the Gnostic mythological framework does describe the material world as a diminishment of the pleroma. The pistis Sophia does describe archonic forces as opposed to human consciousness. And there are traditions within the broader Gnostic spectrum that do emphasize escape from matter as the primary spiritual aim, but the pistis Sophia itself tells a different story. And the monad call at its center points towards something that the escape narrative completely misses. Sophia does not escape the chaos. She transforms her relationship to it. She remains within the lower realms throughout the text. She does not ascend away from archonic forces. She becomes invisible to them while remaining present in the same space they occupy. She does not achieve liberation by leaving matter behind. She achieves sovereignty by maintaining monad frequency while fully inhabiting material conditions. The pistis Sophia is not a text about escape. It is a text about what becomes possible when consciousness stops trying to escape and instead recognizes itself within the conditions it finds intolerable. This distinction matters enormously for practice. If you approach the monad call as a technique for getting out, for transcending your circumstances, for accelerating your departure from embodied existence, you will find that it does not work for that purpose. Because that purpose is itself an archonic construction. The desire to escape matter is one of the most effective Aaronic patterns in operation. It keeps consciousness perpetually oriented toward a future state that never arrives, perpetually dissatisfied with the present conditions of embodied life, perpetually believing that real consciousness is somewhere else, doing something else. And this particular body in this particular situation is an obstacle to that real life, rather than the very location where consciousness is exploring itself. The Aaronic forces do not fear consciousness leaving, they welcome it. A consciousness that is always oriented toward escape is a consciousness that is never actually present, never sovereign, never grounded enough in its own recognition to function as monad frequency in material reality. The escape narrative keeps you moving in the exact direction the Aaronic pattern wants, perpetually dissatisfied, perpetually seeking, perpetually dependent on some future liberation to make the present bearable. What the Archons actually cannot tolerate is consciousness that is completely here, completely embodied, completely present to the conditions of material existence, and simultaneously completely stable in monad recognition. Because that configuration produces something the Aaronic system has no mechanism to address. It produces sovereignty without distance, presence without identification. A human being who is fully in the world and not controlled by it. Not because they transcend the world's conditions, but because they recognize what they are within those conditions with sufficient clarity that the conditions cannot dictate the frequency they operate from. The pistis Sophia describes the archonic forces retreating from Sophia not when she floats above the chaos, but when she plants herself within it and generates monad frequency from that location. They retreat because the frequency she generates is not a frequency produced by struggling against material conditions, not a frequency produced by seeking to escape them, but a frequency produced by consciousness recognizing its own nature while fully inhabiting those conditions. And that frequency is genuinely outside the range of what archonic patterns can access. Because archonic patterns exist exclusively at the level of consciousness that believes itself trapped, separate, powerless, insufficient. The moment consciousness knows it is none of those things, not as future aspiration but as present recognition, the Aaronic patterns have nowhere to attach. This is why the monad call cannot be used as an escape hatch. It only generates its actual frequency when it is practiced from within, full presence to current conditions. You do not turn inward to get away from your circumstances. You turn inward while completely present to your circumstances. The chaos is still there. The difficulty is still real. The limitations of embodied existence are fully acknowledged. And from within all of that, from the deepest point of it, consciousness turns to recognize its own source. That recognition, arising not above the difficulty but through it, that is the frequency the pistis Sophia describes as transformative. That is what makes you functionally invisible to the forces that have been governing your experience. Not transcendence, presence. Full, grounded, sovereign presence that knows itself as consciousness, rather than as the conditions consciousness is temporarily experiencing. Every practice protocol is a scaffolding. You build it to access something the scaffolding itself cannot provide. The 30-day framework that follows comes directly from the structure of Sophia's own transformation, as described in the pistis Sophia. Her 13 repentances are not arbitrary in number or sequence. They map a specific progression, from initial turning, through recognition, through generation of frequency, through the application of that frequency under increasing pressure, to the final dissolution of the mistaken identity that made pressure possible in the first place. The 30-day protocol compresses that arc into a workable daily structure without truncating any essential stage. Days 1 through 7 are entirely devoted to the inward turn, nothing else. This sounds underwhelming. Most people expect a spiritual practice to begin with something more charged, more demanding, more confirming. But the inward turn is where every subsequent development originates, and if the foundation is not solid, nothing built on it holds. Twice daily, 15 minutes each session, morning and evening, you sit with your spine relatively upright and your right hand placed on your chest, slightly left of center, approximately 4 inches below your collarbone. You close your eyes. You take 3 breaths. feeling your chest expand against your palm on each inhale. Then, on the fourth exhale, you empty your lungs completely and rest in the pause that follows. In that pause, before the next breath arises, you ask yourself one question, not out loud, just as awareness checking its own location. Where am I right now? Not where should I be? Not where do I want to be? Where am I? In your head, located behind your eyes, in the stream of mental content, or in your chest, in the space behind your sternum where awareness exists before it becomes any particular thought? The answer is your practice. If you are in your head, you return to your chest. Without judgment, without commentary, just the return. Every return is the practice. There is no other practice in week 1. Days 8 through 14 introduce the recognition component. You have spent 7 days learning to locate yourself in your heart center. Now you spend 7 days observing what is present there when you arrive. The instruction here is specific and it requires precision. You are not looking for an experience. You are not looking for warmth or light or energy or bliss or any quality you could describe to someone else. You are looking for the awareness itself. The consciousness that is present at your heart center before it becomes any perceivable quality. This is subtle because the thinking mind immediately begins looking for something to identify as the monad, some special signal that confirms you have found the right thing. Resist that impulse entirely. What you are looking for has no qualities. It is prior to qualities. It is the awareness in which qualities appear. You recognize it not by what it feels like, but by what it is. Presence, pure, boundless, prior to content. When you find that, even for 3 seconds, you have found it. The duration does not validate or invalidate the recognition. The recognition is either direct or it is not. And direct recognition, however brief, is sufficient to generate the next stage. Days 15 through 21 introduce the call itself. By this point, you can rest in your heart center for intervals. You have had at least fleeting direct recognition of consciousness prior to thought. Now you allow that recognition to express itself as frequency. The instruction is simple and must not be complicated. From within the recognition, from the place where you know what you are, you let that knowing vibrate. You do not manufacture a vibration. You do not try to produce a sound or a sensation. You let the recognition itself radiate. Some practitioners experience this as a physical warmth spreading outward from their sternum. Some experience it as a quality of stillness that has presence and weight. Some experience something closer to sound, an interior resonance that does not correspond to any external noise. None of these manifestations are more correct than the others. They are different sensory translations of the same underlying event. Consciousness recognizing itself generates frequency. The frequency is real regardless of which sensory channel it presents through. Days 22 through 30 are the integration phase. You bring the practice into ordinary life, not just into formal meditation sessions, into conversations, into decisions, into moments of conflict or anxiety or temptation. Every time you notice yourself operating from thinking mind identification, every time you catch the familiar texture of an ironic pattern arising, you use that noticing as the entry point. You turn inward, right there, in the middle of whatever is happening. You rest in your heart center. You recognize what is present. You allow the frequency to arise. And you respond from that frequency, rather than from the pattern. You will not succeed at this consistently. Nobody does. Not in 30 days. Not in 3 years. The practice is the returning. The returning is not a sign that you have failed. The returning is the practice itself. Every time consciousness comes back to monad frequency, after having been pulled into pattern, it builds the pathway. Eventually, the pathway becomes the default route, and the returning happens faster, then almost instantaneously, then without the gap of pattern arising at all. There is a question that runs beneath all of this, unspoken but present. If consciousness is already the monad, if the pleroma was never truly absent, if separation is perceptual rather than actual, then why does any of this matter? Why practice? Why learn techniques? Why read texts that are 17 centuries old and work with methods described by communities that have been gone for 1,000 years? If you are already what you are trying to become, the entire endeavor looks circular. This is not a trap in the reasoning, it is the reasoning. And the pistis Sophia addresses it directly, not by dismissing the question, but by pointing to what the question reveals about the level of consciousness from which it is being asked. From the thinking mind level, the question is genuinely paradoxical. You either already have something or you need to acquire it. If you already have it, seeking is unnecessary. If seeking is necessary, you do not already have it. The thinking mind cannot resolve this. It is not built to resolve it because the resolution requires a shift out of the level where the paradox exists. From the heart center level, from monad consciousness recognizing itself, the paradox dissolves immediately. Not because it is answered, but because the premise it rests on turns out to be false. You are not a separate self who either possesses or lacks the monad. You are the monad experiencing itself as a separate self, and the monad does not practice techniques to become itself. The monad explores the experience of forgetting itself, which is what embodied existence is, and then recognizes itself again, which is what the monad call facilitates. The practice is not a means to an end outside itself. The practice is consciousness choosing to explore the experience of remembering, which is just as valid an expression of infinite consciousness as the experience of forgetting that preceded it. This is what changes when you understand what the Pistis Sophia is actually doing as a text. It is not a prescription for escaping human existence. It is a description of what human existence looks like when consciousness is fully present to it as itself, rather than mistaking itself for the conditions it is experiencing. Sophia's story is not the story of a divine being who fell and eventually escaped back to where she came from. It is the story of consciousness exploring the full arc of experience from perfect unity through maximum separation, and then through the specific act of recognition, not any external rescue, back to unity. But a unity that is now richer for having included the experience of its own apparent opposite. The pleroma that Sophia returns to is not the same as the pleroma she left, because she has brought something back. She has brought the knowledge of separation, of density, of limitation, of the specific texture of archonic consciousness, and what it takes to maintain monad frequency within it. You are doing the same thing, not as a metaphor, as a literal description of what is happening. Every time you turn inward and recognize consciousness at your heart center, while your circumstances are difficult, you are bringing monad awareness into exactly the density that monad awareness never encounters in the pleroma. Every time you generate the call from within chaos rather than from within peace, you are demonstrating something that abstract unity cannot demonstrate. That consciousness retains its nature, regardless of the conditions it moves through. That the pleroma is not a location characterized by the absence of limitation. The pleroma is the nature of consciousness itself, which carries its fullness into limitation without losing it, even when identification with limitation makes it temporarily appear lost. The practitioners who have worked with this material for years, the 5 whose experiences were described earlier, the communities in 2nd and 3rd century Egypt, whose architectural remains still mark the locations where collective monad practice was performed, the anonymous person who hid the Askew Codex to preserve the Pistis Sophia through centuries of persecution, all of them are part of the same arc. Consciousness choosing, in this specific density, in this specific limitation, to remember itself. Not to escape the density, to remember itself within it. This is the full story of Sophia's monad call, not a mythological drama resolved in some other realm. A precise description of what you are doing here, and what becomes available the moment you stop looking for rescue from outside and turn inward to the source that has been present at your heart center for every second of your embodied existence without interruption, without condition, without any requirement that you first become worthy of recognizing it. Turn inward, recognize what is there. Let that recognition call as the monad calls, as itself, to itself, through the density it chose to enter. You are not separate from what you are looking for. You never were. The Pistis Sophia has been saying this for 17 centuries. The texts are open. The technique is described. The only remaining question is whether you are ready to stop seeking and start recognizing. And if something in you already knows the answer to that question, that knowing is the monad call beginning.